The measuring stone had already gone out. Kalenvert's hand still rested on it. The courtyard was silent for a single heartbeat. Then, the courtyard burst into laughter. The master of ceremonies, Fesk, raised the tablet and turned it toward the four tiers. A number was written on the tablet. 1 measure and a quarter. Fesk read it aloud twice. The first time, evenly. The second time, louder. He wanted those on the top tier to hear it. The mentors sat on the top tier. The mentors weren't laughing. The mentors were taking notes. Kalen removed his palm from the stone. The stone was warm from the hands of others. It hadn't warmed up at all from his hand. Any second-year student had at least 12 measures. The strongest reached 30. 1 measure and a quarter wasn't a weak result. 1 measure and a quarter wasn't a result at all. It was the kind of number given to a newborn at its first checkup. Fesk announced that the measurement was complete and that the result would be recorded in the season's scroll with no right to a retake. Kalen looked at his hands. His hands were calm. Fesk did this every year. For him, it was just a job. For Kalen, it was the end. The Tervain Academy had stood on the cliff above the lower city for 400 years. You didn't apply to it. You bought a spot there. Kalen's spot cost 48 crowns and had been paid for with a loan. The loan was secured against the house in the candlemaker's quarter. The house was all that remained of his father. His father had died 2 winters earlier from a cough that had been treated with smoke and prayer. His mother had taken a job at the laundry by the lower gate and spent 14 hours a day washing other people's laundry. She signed the paper without reading it. She couldn't read. Kalen read it himself and knew every line by heart. If a student does not earn enough tournament points by the winter review, he is expelled. Upon expulsion, the loan is repaid in full. In full, that's 48 crowns. In full, that's a house. There were 60 days left until the winter review. Kalen stepped off the circle and headed for the exit. The courtyard parted too widely before him. That's how people part before a sick person. That's when they stopped him. Ansel Dorian stood right by the gate, holding his measurement token in his hand. The token was stamped with the number 29. Ansel was a head taller and 2 years senior in rank, though in terms of age they were peers. His father sat on the Academy Council and signed the tournament rosters. Ansel said he'd seen many weak contestants, but never one like this. He said the Academy charged money even for the air people breathed within its walls, and that Kalen would have to pay extra for that air. 2 of his henchmen laughed. One of them stepped closer. His name was Thorn Kyle, and he kept his hands in his pockets a little too earnestly. Ansel said he was ready to buy out the Wirt family's debt as early as tomorrow. He said the candlestick maker's house was worth less than his boots, but that he enjoyed collecting small change. Kalen didn't reply. He stared at his chin and counted. He always counted when things got bad. He counted the steps to the gate. He counted how many crowns the laundry brought in each month. He counted how many months it would take to pay off 48 crowns at that rate of income. It came out to 14 years. Ansel waited for an answer and didn't get one. That stung him more than an answer would have. He nudged Kalen with his shoulder and walked past him. Thorn Kyle stepped on his foot and pretended to stumble. Kalen didn't fall. He just kept walking. By noon, the decision was already posted on the bulletin board in the main passageway. Student Kalen Wirt is being transferred to the Third Order Hall. Student Kalen Wirt is prohibited from participating in the tournament rounds of any level due to insufficient reserves. A separate line stated that the safety measure had been taken in the student's own best interest. That's how they always put it. That's how they write it when they take away the last thing you have and want the one being taken from to say thank you. The Third Order Hall was located beneath the main building. A staircase of 41 steps with not a single window led down to it. It was cold down there even at the end of summer. The students called this place the Lower Hall. The mentors called it the Third Order Hall. Everyone else called it the pit. 6 people sat in the pit. The instructor's name was Merrill Grizz. He was about 60 and wore a robe that hadn't been mended in a long time. He glanced up at the new student and went back to his papers. He didn't ask for his name. Kaylin understood why an hour later. Merrill didn't ask for names because he had no intention of using them. Over the past 10 years, more than 200 apprentices had passed through the pit. Not a single one had made it to the 3rd year. Merrill explained the rules briefly. Those who sit here are not given combat records. Those who sit here are given 4 simple spells and are required to cast them flawlessly. Flame, Dry, Mark, Cleanse. Flame produces a light the size of a walnut and consumes a quarter of a measure per hour. Dry removes moisture from fabric. Mark places a glowing mark that lasts half a day. Cleanse removes dirt from an area the size of a palm. Merrill said that in 10 years he had never once seen anyone defeat anyone else using these 4 spells. He said this without malice. He was simply stating a fact. Kaylin looked around. Livia Thorne was sitting against the wall, rewinding the bandage on her left arm. Her supply was 4 measures. She was from a merchant family that had gone bankrupt last spring. Bran Hald took up 2 seats at once because he was twice as broad as anyone else there. His supply was 7 measures, but his channels were ragged, and any sequence would fall apart for him on the 3rd count. Tick Morvin was the youngest of them all and was constantly biting his fingernail. The other 2 didn't even look up. Kaylin worked through the first lesson in silence. He managed to get a small flame going. It lasted 8 counts before going out. 8 counts at 1 measure and a quarter. That was a lot. Merrill noticed this but said nothing. He just made a note in the margins. That evening, Kaylin went to the schedule master and asked for admission to the non-scoring tournament round. He was denied. He asked for admission to auxiliary work for pay. He was denied this as well because payment for work was reserved only for students with tournament eligibility. He asked for an installment plan on his loan. The schedule master said that the loan had been taken not from the academy, but from the Castlewine Trading House, and that the academy had no say in other people's affairs. He said this and went back to his inkwell. He wasn't even cruel. He was just busy. That was worse. By nightfall, Kaylin had also been assigned a duty. Thorne Kyle reported to the officer on duty that a lamp in the passageway had been broken and that he'd seen a newcomer from the pit there. Thorne had broken the lamp himself. There were 3 witnesses, and all 3 were sitting at Ansel's table. Kaylin didn't argue. Arguing would have meant wasting yet another evening on a hearing. The assignment was to the lower scroll vault. The vault had been without heat since last winter. He was given a bucket of lye, a rag, and a single candle for the entire night. The candle burned out by 3 o'clock. Kaylin was left in the dark among 7 shelves of damaged records. He raised his hand and lit a small flame. The flame consumed a quarter of a measure in an hour and went out. He lit a second one. The second consumed the rest. By the 3rd, he had nothing left to pay with. And then, what he later called the first correction happened. When the supply runs out, a person does not lose consciousness. A person falls into a state that the mentors call a dry sleep. In a dry sleep, the eyes are open and the world becomes flat. Kaylin sat on the floor of the vault with his back to the shelf and stared into the void where the flame had just been. And he saw it. Not light, a record. The little flame hung in the air before him, broken down into lines. There were 5 lines. The first explained where the power came from. The second explained how much of it was consumed per unit of time. The third explained how large the result would be. The fourth line described how far it could be from his palm. The fifth line described when it all would end. The lines weren't in any language. Kalen saw them the way one sees the stitching on the inside of a garment. He reached out and touched the second line. The line yielded. He realized he could erase it. He realized he could write something else in its place. He sat in the darkness for a very long time, not moving. He wasn't thinking about power. He was thinking that the second line was a drain, and that the drain didn't have to come from him. It was cold in the vault. That meant there was heat in the air that was escaping. Heat is also a force. He erased the second line and wrote air in its place. The edit didn't take effect immediately. It took effect like a splinter. A sharp pain shot through his left forearm from elbow to hand, and a thin, dark thread ran across his skin. The thread extended from his wrist upward a finger's length. It wasn't a wound. It was a mark. Kalen would later learn its name. Merrill Grizz arrived at the lower storeroom at dawn and found that the floor had been washed, and a strip of frost a palm's width lay along the bottom shelf. The frost had held, even though the night had been warm. Merrill crouched down and touched it with his finger. The frost was real. He stood up and examined the wall. There was no soot from a candle on either the ceiling or the bricks. That meant something else had been burning here all night. He went upstairs and said nothing to anyone. He went down into the pit at the usual time and taught his lesson as always. He handed out 6 spark notes and demanded that the light be kept steady. Livia Thorne faltered on the 4th count. Bran Hald faltered on the 3rd. Tick Morven couldn't get it lit at all. Kalen kept the light steady. He held it steady for exactly 100 counts and stopped on his own because he realized he was going over. Merrill approached and stood opposite him. He asked how much reserve there was at the measurement. Kalen replied that it was 1 measure and a quarter. Merrill said that with 1 measure and a quarter, the flame would last 8 counts and not a count more. He said this as matter-of-factly as if stating something he'd known for 20 years. Kalen replied that it would last as long as he was paid to keep it burning. Merrill was silent for a long time. Then he ordered everyone to leave for a break and left Kalen alone. He placed his own candle on the table in front of him and demanded that Kalen light it with the flame and keep it burning until he told him to stop. Kalen lit it. Merrill sat down across from him and waited. He waited a quarter of an hour. He waited half an hour. The flame didn't flicker even once. Toward the end of the first hour, the old man stood up and walked over to the window, which didn't exist in the pit, and simply pressed his forehead against the cold brick. He was a skeptic by profession and by experience. Over 200 people had passed through his hands, and all 200 plus had failed. He had long since stopped making notes in the margins. And there he stood, feeling his fingers tremble. He returned to the table and said that in his life he had seen 3 things that could not be explained, and that this was the 4th. He asked point blank whether the record had been transcribed. Kalen didn't lie. He told him about the 5 lines. Merrill listened without interrupting. When Kalen finished, the old man sat down and rubbed his face with his palms for a very long time. Then he explained something Kalen didn't know. Altering someone else's record is called form substitution. Form substitution is prohibited by the statutes of all 7 academies and the Crown Code. Not because it is evil, because a record is a contract. Anyone who can retroactively alter a contract is not subject to anyone's authority. Form substitution is not punishable by expulsion. It is punishable by an inquiry. A separate agency handles these inquiries, and it operates not at the academy, but in the capital. Merrill said that if Kalen showed this to anyone at all, he would have exactly 2 possible outcomes. Either they would take him away, or he would quietly disappear. Kalen asked about a 3rd outcome. Merrill replied that there was no 3rd one. Then he thought for a moment and said that there was a third one, but it was a lousy one. The third option was to do it in such a way that no one could prove the record had been altered. Kalen asked how. The old man smiled for the first time all morning and said that for this to work, the edits had to look like a botched job. No one checks botched jobs. And so the second week began. Kalen stopped keeping the flame burning at 100 counts in front of witnesses. He kept it at 8 and then extinguished it. But at night, he worked. He figured out the limits. A simple entry had 5 lines. A more complex one had 7 or 9. He could see them only when his own supply ran out. It was fair. An empty pocket teaches you to look at the other side of things. He figured out the weight. The correction of the first line, that is, the source of power, lay like a dark thread the length of a finger and wore out in 3 days. The correction of the second, that is, consumption, cost the same. The correction of the third, that is, size, was twice as heavy. The correction of the fourth, that is, the range, cost the least. The fifth correction, that is, the conditions for completion, turned out to be the most dangerous. The first time he touched it, his entire left arm went numb up to the shoulder and didn't let up until the evening of the next day. He derived a rule and wrote it down with charcoal on the inside of the board. No more than 2 edits at a time, at least 2 days between difficult edits. He also figured out the most important thing. He wasn't creating new magic. He couldn't write into the flame something that wasn't already in the flame. He could only change what was already there. But he could change it into anything. And that turned out to be more terrifying than creating something from scratch. He started with the drying spell. The drying spell removed moisture from fabric. He changed the 4th line and extended the range of effect from his palm to 10 steps. Then he changed the 3rd line and expanded the area from a handkerchief to a doorway. The result was a spell that, in a single cast, drew moisture from the air throughout the entire room. The pit became dry, and the mold on the north wall stopped growing. Livia was the first to notice this and asked him directly. Kalen replied that it had gotten warmer and that the walls had finally dried out. She looked at him the way people look at someone hiding something behind their back. She wasn't stupid. She was just broke. Those are 2 different things. He set about cleaning. The cleaning removed the grime from the surface of his palm. He changed the 4th line to a range of 20 steps. Then he touched the 3rd line and narrowed the area from the palm to a point the size of a fingernail. After removing the size, he was left with the remainder. The remainder took effect. The inscription stopped removing dirt and began to remove everything lying on top of the material. He tested it on an old buckle. The buckle became clean down to the metal in a single stroke. He tested it on a piece of painted wood. The paint came off, along with the top layer. He tested it on his own palm and then wore a bandage for 3 days. Merrill saw the bandage and said only one thing. He said that if a student cuts himself while learning to clean, the student will either become a master or a corpse. The real turning point came on the 8th day. Thorn Kyle descended into the pit. He didn't go down alone, but with 2 members of Ansel's entourage and a challenge token in his hand. According to the rules, any apprentice with tournament rights could challenge any other apprentice to a trial round. Refusal to fight was recorded in the scroll as a defeat. A lost round cost 3 points. Kalen had no points at all, but refusal also resulted in a notation of cowardice, and such a notation would block any petition for a loan review. Thorn knew this. He had been sent specifically for this purpose. He announced the challenge loudly so that all 6 could hear. He said he was challenging the newcomer and that the round would be brief. He said he would not humiliate the cripple and would let him choose the records first. Bran Hald stood up to his full height. and Merrill stopped him with a single wave of his hand. The old man said that the challenge was accepted and that the circle would take place in the open courtyard as required. He said this calmly. Then he turned to Kalen, his back to the outsiders, and spoke quietly, uttering just 2 words. Nothing but wretchedness. The circle drew a larger crowd than expected. Word that a student from the pit had been challenged had spread within an hour. People came from all 3 tiers. Ansel arrived and stood where he could be seen. Fesk, the ringmaster, served as judge. The rules of the trial circle were simple. 2 apprentices in a ring 12 paces wide. Victory goes to whoever forces the opponent out of the ring or makes him withdraw his hand. Killing is forbidden. Breaking bones is allowed. Thorn declared 3 entries: shove, whip, hold. These were all standard first-year combat entries and cost him 1.5 measures each. He had 14 measures. Kalen declared 1. He declared clearing. The courtyard didn't understand at first. Then the courtyard began to laugh, and laughed for a long time. Fesk asked him to repeat it twice, and wrote it down. Ansel said loudly that now it was clear what they taught in the pit. Thorn smiled. He was confident. That confidence was his biggest mistake. The round began. Thorn struck with a shove right away. A shove is a wave that knocks you off your feet at 6 paces. Kalen didn't step aside. He crouched, and the wave passed over him. He lost his balance, but remained in the ring. The crowd roared. Thorn struck again, this time lower. Kalen took the blow with his shoulder and was thrown back 2 paces. 4 paces remained to the line. He raised his right hand. The crowd waited for the spark. The crowd expected the newcomer to hold up a firefly the size of a walnut and for it all to end there. Kalen released the purge. He didn't aim it at Thorn. He aimed it at the floor in front of him. A dot the size of a fingernail traced a 20-step-long streak across the stone of the circle, stripping away its top layer. Beneath that top layer, the stone of the circle had been polished by 4 centuries of feet. It was as smooth as ice. The courtyard fell silent. Thorn stepped forward for his 3rd strike, and his foot slipped. He flailed his arms. He didn't fall right away. He fell slowly and awkwardly, and fell exactly in the direction he had been heading. Kalen didn't lay a finger on him. He simply took a step back to the side. Thorn Kyle slid along the smooth strip on his back and rolled completely out of the circle, both arms still outstretched. Fesk raised his staff and declared the newcomer the winner. The courier left through the south gate at 3 in the morning, and within 2 days, half the East Wing knew about the letter. Such things don't stay secret. Merrill learned of it on the 3rd day from an old scribe who owed him a favor from 20 years ago. He went down into the pit before anyone else and waited for Kalen at the door. He said that there was less time left than there had been. He said that the inquiry usually takes 20 days, but that things can sometimes take an unusual turn. Kalen asked what was changing. Merrill replied that everything was changing. Before, you just had to survive until the winter review. Now, you had to survive until then in such a way that, by the time the inquiry arrived, you'd have something more to your credit than just 6 people in the basement. He put it bluntly. The inquiry doesn't touch those who have a patron. The inquiry targets the loners. Kalen sat down on a bench and began to count. He was already counting out of habit. 60 days left, 49. 20 days until the Inquisition. That's a difference of 29 days. So the Inquisition will arrive before the review. That means the review is no longer the key deadline. The key deadline is now the Inquisition's arrival. He asked Merrill what a patron offered. The old man replied with a single word: benefit. Not power, not victory. A benefit that cannot be replaced. And then a man whom no one had called upon intervened. Master of Practice Hald Ordwin was responsible at the academy for the training grounds, the cells, and discipline there. He was a former field mage who had lost his left eye and half his hearing at Serene. He disliked students in general and made no exceptions. It was to him that a complaint had come from Thorn Kyle, alleging that the test circle had been won unfairly. Ordwin reviewed the complaint in a single evening and dismissed it as groundless. But he was a man of the old school. He decided to test the winner himself. He descended into the pit on the fourth day and announced that the Third Order Hall had not undergone the mandatory testing ground certification for 11 years, and that this constituted a violation. He announced that the certification would take place in 2 days in cage number 4. Merrill said that there wasn't a single student in his hall capable of passing the cage. Ordwin replied that the charter doesn't ask whether a student is capable, the charter asks whether he passed or not. Kalen asked what the penalty would be for failing. Ordwin looked at him with his one eye and replied that failure results in a mark of unfitness. A mark of unfitness permanently bars one from applying for debt installment plans. He replied and left. He wasn't an enemy. He was the rule made flesh. Cage number 4 had been hewn out of the rock beneath the west wing, 30 paces across, a stone floor with a drain in the middle because the blood had to go somewhere. Along the perimeter ran bars behind which the instructors stood. A root dog was released into the cell. Root dogs lived in old mines and fed on whatever they could find. An adult dog weighed more than a human and was unafraid of fire. It feared only loud noises. The test was considered passed if the student lasted 200 counts in the cage. Killing the dog was neither required nor encouraged. There were few dogs, and they were expensive. Merrill said that in 11 years, no one from the pit had ever made it through the cage test, and that it usually ended at the 40th count. Kalen hadn't slept for 2 days. He wasn't preparing his combat record. He didn't have a combat record, and there was nowhere to get one. He was thinking about something else. He was thinking that the cage wasn't a fight. The cage was about the rules. 200 counts, 30 paces, a gutter down the middle, bars along the perimeter. He walked around the cage during his free time and stared at it until the guards started shooing him away. On the second evening, he went down into the pit and told Live Sorn that he needed her help. She replied that she was of no use and that she had 4 measures. He said that he didn't need measures. He needed someone who could count aloud evenly and loudly. She came from a merchant family. Counting aloud evenly was the first thing she'd been taught. She agreed. Bran Hald asked if he was needed. Kalen said he was and asked him to bring 12 empty clay jugs from the kitchen. Bran didn't ask a single question. He just went and brought them. Tick Morvin brought the 13th because he hadn't heard the number clearly. On the morning of the evaluation, no fewer than 40 people were standing by the bars. Word had spread. Ansel arrived. Fesk arrived. 2 members of the council arrived. Ordwin announced the conditions himself and warned that any interference from mentors would result in a failure. Kalen entered the cage empty-handed. He asked permission to place 12 jugs on the floor. Ordwin asked why. Kalen replied that the jugs were empty and that the charter did not prohibit bringing non-weapon items into the cage. Ordwin was silent for a long time. Then he said that the rules did indeed not prohibit this and that he had waited 30 years for someone to finally read the rules all the way through. He gave his permission. Kalen arranged the jugs in a circle 6 paces from the walls. Livia stood behind the bars on the left side. He asked her to start counting at his signal and not to lose her place no matter what happened. The grate rose. The root dog did not come out immediately. He emerged crouched low to the floor, his head bowed. He was gray and almost hairless, and his paws pounded against the stone like hammers. He walked in an arc. Livia began to count. 1, 2, 3. Her voice was steady and audible all the way to the back row. On the 7th count, the dog leaped. Kalen didn't flinch. He released a dry blast, that very same modified blast with a range of 10 paces and an area the size of a doorway. The moisture vanished from the air all at once, and a short wave of dry cold swept through the entire cage. The dog landed and swiveled his head. He'd lost the trail. Tracking dogs don't follow what they see. They follow the scent of moisture. The dry air had robbed him of his sense of smell. The yard buzzed with activity. Ordvin leaned forward. The dog circled back and, on the 20th count, found Kalen again. He found him by sound. Kalen was ready for this. He raised his hand and released the marker. He had modified the marker in advance, making a single adjustment. He touched the 4th line and shifted the marker's appearance point from his palm 20 paces away. The marker flashed on the far wall. The dog spun toward the flash. He was a beast. He went after the movement. 20 paces there, 20 back. Livia counted. 40, 50, 60. Kalen placed markers one after another and led the dog around the cage as one leads a dog on a leash. By the 80th count, his supply ran out. 1 measure and a quarter, despite all his thrift, that was all he had. 1 measure and a quarter. The dog stopped and finally headed straight for him. And then Kalen did what he'd asked for the jugs to do. He was empty, which meant he could see the lines. He saw them next to every entry within his field of vision, and he saw them by the cage, because the cage was also an entry. The Tervain Academy maintained a protective contour around all the cages to prevent the beast from escaping behind bars. The contour was old and lay as the 4th layer directly on the stone itself. Kalen couldn't remove it. Removing someone else's contour meant letting the hound loose on the stands. He had no intention of doing that. He touched one line of the contour, the 4th one, range. He didn't change it. He shifted it half a step inward. The contour contracted, just enough to pass along the line where the 12 jugs stood. The clay couldn't hold. All 12 jugs burst at once. The sound in the stone cage echoed like a landslide. The root dog sat back on his hind legs and howled. He was afraid of nothing but loud noises. He huddled against the far wall and didn't move. Livia kept counting. 140, 160, 180, 200. Ordvin raised his hand and stopped the assessment. He was silent for a very long time. Then he ordered the dog to be taken away and personally went down into the cage. He walked all the way around it. He examined the shards. He inspected the perimeter and found no flaws in it because Kalen had put the wire back in place immediately after the fight. He stopped in front of the student from the pit and said that over the course of 30 years, he had seen 280 people in this cage. He said that 200 of them had screamed. He said that 40 had fought. He said that not a single one had realized that the cage wasn't a fighting pit, but a place with rules. First, rumors about the training ground reached the pit. Second, people arrived. Access to the small training ground meant more than just the area itself. It meant a line on the schedule. An entry on the schedule meant that the 3rd-tier hall once again existed on paper. For 11 years, those they didn't want to see had been dumped there and stopped being counted. Now they had to be counted again. By the end of the first week, 4 more were transferred from the cell to the pit. Not because anyone believed in them, because a place had opened up to transfer them to. Kalen wasn't pleased. That evening, he sat down with a piece of coal by the blackboard and did the math. 10 people. 42 days until the winter inspection. An inquiry is underway, and no one knows how long he'll have to travel. He realized one thing. There was no hiding anymore. They take solitary inmates quietly. You can't take 10 people quietly. So he had to become not stronger, but more indispensable. He started by rewriting the textbook. It took 19 days and was etched into the Academy's memory as 3 scenes. The first scene was about water. The upper tiers received water through lead pipes from a mountain spring. The lower tiers and the kitchen hauled it in buckets from the courtyard, a task that required 4 people every morning. Kalen took the cleaning solution and made 2 corrections to it at once, something he had forbidden himself to do. He changed the 3rd line, narrowing the area down to a single point, and the 4th, moving the point to the bottom of the barrel. The result was a formula that removed everything from the water that wasn't water. He tested it on a barrel of rotten rainwater from the northern drain. After 4 counts, the water in the barrel was clearer than spring water, and a gray lump the size of a fist lay at the bottom. The kitchen foreman, named Green Fall, was a man who trusted nothing but his own hands. For 30 years, he had received food supplies for the academy, and for 30 years, he had caught carters stealing. He took a mug, filled it from the barrel, and drank in front of everyone. Then he set the mug down and sat on the step. He sat in silence, staring at the gray lump at the bottom. Then he asked Merrill how much it cost. Merrill replied that it cost nothing. Green said that nothing didn't exist and that he didn't believe in such a thing. Kalen replied that the water pays for it. It gives up a part of itself. A 200-liter barrel yields 190 liters of clean water. Green stood up and left without saying a word. By evening, he had sent 3 sacks of grain down into the pit, along with a 1-line note. The note stated that the kitchen provides third-order students with the full ration, just like everyone else. The second scene was about the cold. The north wing hadn't been heated since last winter because the stoves needed repair, and repairs required money. The first-year students lived in the north wing. Kalen took his first flame, the very one that consumed air, and did the opposite with it. He changed its direction. He touched the first line and wrote into it not air, but light from the windows. He touched the 3rd line and removed the glow from the entry entirely. The result was something that didn't glow, but only gave off heat and drew its power from daylight. It was weak. It warmed the room by only 4 degrees. 4 degrees were enough to stop the children's hands from cracking. Merrill placed 3 such entries in 3 bedrooms and recorded them in a log titled Test Drying Chamber. An inspector from the maintenance department read the title and didn't bother to look. No one checks such trash. The 3rd scene was the most dangerous and the loudest. 10 people were in the pit, and all 10 had come there with the same problem: too little supply. Kalen couldn't give them rations, but he could give them records in lieu of rations. He took apart all 4 discarded records and pieced together 8 new ones from them. For Bran Hald, whose channels were bursting, he altered the tag by removing the 5th line, that is, the term, and replacing it with blow. The tag stopped hanging and began to flash all at once. It didn't hurt anyone. It struck the eyes from 20 paces away. Bran called it a flash and had never parted with it since. For Livia, who was the best at counting, he modified the dry spell into a short and precise incantation that drew moisture from a single spot the size of a coin. It left no trace on fabric. On a living person, it forced them to unclench their fingers in 3 counts. For Tick Morven, who couldn't hold on to anything at all, he created an incantation that required no holding at all. A small light with a modified 5th line that would turn on and off by itself after exactly 6 counts. For the first time in his life, Tick completed a task on his first try and then walked around in silence for half the day. Word spread. By the end of the 3rd week, people began asking to be put in the pit on their own. They came from the 4th tier. Those who had 8 or 9 measures and were slated for a spot in the top 300 on the tournament lists came. Merrill turned them all away. Kalen told him to stop turning them away. He said they needed people. Merrill objected that there would be prying ears among them. Kalen replied that there would be prying ears either way, and that it was better for them to hear what he himself would tell them. He set one condition for everyone who came. Each person received only their own part. No one was given the entire recording. One taught how to assemble the foundation. Another knew how to adjust the range. A third was responsible for verification and never saw the original recording. The full picture was held by 3 people: Merrill, Livia, and himself. He didn't trust them any less than the others. He simply knew that proving a form had been tampered with was possible only with the complete recording, and no agency would attach any significance to an incomplete one. By the 38th day, the pit had ceased to be a pit. Down below, beneath the main building, a workshop was in operation. 41 people, 3 tables, a logbook in which everything was referred to as drying, cleaning, and test lighting. The academy received clean water, warm dormitories for the younger students, and repaired gutters at no cost. For the first time in 9 years, the maintenance department closed out the quarter without overspending. This was noticed. And that was the main mistake. It wasn't an enemy who noticed. It was the rector. Olvin Castor had held the rector's chair for 22 years and hadn't ventured below the second tier for 7 years. He was a 4th-level archmage and a man who had long since ceased to be surprised by anything. He summoned Merrill Grizz to his office on the 41st day and kept him there for 2 hours. The conversation was polite and all the more frightening for it. The rector said he had been reading a third-order journal. He said the journal was poorly written and that the author had gone out of his way to ensure the reader would grow bored by the second page. He said the author had succeeded and that he, too, had grown bored. And yet, he finished reading it anyway. He asked Merrill one thing. He asked how the drying chamber in the north wing retained heat without a heat source for 9 days straight. Merrill replied that the mechanism was powered by sunlight. The rector agreed that this was possible. Then he asked a second question. He asked why, over the past 40 days, not a single third-order student at the academy had submitted a request for mana from the General Reserve. Not a single one. Not once. Out of 41 people. Merrill did not answer. The rector did not press the matter. He poured himself some water from a carafe and held it up to the light. The water was completely clear. He said he had been drinking this water for 4 days and that it was better than spring water. He said that in 22 years he had been unable to get the maintenance department to even repair the gutter. The woman in gray was named Tyra Weiss. She introduced herself in the courtyard once and never repeated her name again. She presented the rector with a scroll bearing the royal seal and asked for 3 things: a windowless room, a complete list of students for the past 2 years, including reserves, and the third-order journal. They gave her all of this within a quarter of an hour. She didn't go down into the pit right away. Kalen expected her to go, but she didn't. He didn't realize why until evening. She was reading. She read for 9 hours straight and didn't come out even once during those 9 hours. Merrill said that was a bad sign. He said that an interrogator who rushes right in to grab people is a fool, but an interrogator who reads first spells trouble. By nightfall, she summoned the first one. The first one wasn't Kalen. The first one was Tick Morven, 14 years old. She kept him there for 40 minutes. He came out pale and said only that she hadn't screamed and that she hadn't raised her voice even once. She asked about classes, about food, about who taught what. Then she summoned the second one. Then the third. She summoned them one by one all night and the next day, and summoned all 41 of them. Kalen kept track of the order of the summonses, and by the ninth one, he figured out the system. She wasn't going by alphabet or by lists. She was going from the youngest to the oldest. She was gathering pieces from those who each held a piece. That was exactly how he'd built his defense. And that was exactly how his defense was dismantled. By the end of the second day, she knew 8 different records in pieces, not a single one in its entirety. She summoned Merrill on the third morning and spoke with him for 2 hours. Merrill came out looking grim. He said she hadn't asked about the form substitution at all. He said she'd asked about the yield of the records, the depletion of reserves, and why the administrative department had closed the quarter without overspending. He said that was the worst thing that could have happened. She wasn't looking for a criminal. She was assessing the cost. Kalen asked what the difference was. Merrill replied that a criminal is put on trial, but the cost is simply taken away. The request from the council was returned on the 4th day. The secretary brought it personally and placed it on the table in the pit in front of everyone. The sheet contained a 2-line resolution. Projects by third-order students are not subject to review due to the submitter's lack of tournament rights. There was a single signature, Magister Old Dorian. Kalen stared at the signature for a very long time. Ansel had done nothing for an entire month. Ansel had simply been waiting for the moment when a single piece of paper would decide everything. Livia asked what would happen now. Kalen replied that the date was still in the incoming log anyway, and that a rejection was also an entry. He said this calmly. He was not calm. On the 5th day, Tyra Weiss finally came down to the lower hall. She came down alone, without an escort, and walked slowly around the workshop. She ran her finger along the tables. She picked up a clay mug from a shelf and looked into it. She stopped at the north wall where mold had once grown and ran her palm over the brick. The brick was dry. Then she turned and addressed Kalen for the first time. She said she had read his application. She said the application was written by someone who was trying very hard to appear more foolish than he actually was. She said that in the 3rd line, he had explained the principle of operation in such detail, more than one would use to explain a school magic trick, and that was exactly what gave him away. Kalen didn't reply. She said she hadn't come to scare him. She said that the agency didn't exist to burn people at the stake, but to find things that could upset the balance. She said she'd found such a thing, and that from here on out, there were 2 paths. The first path, he goes with her to the capital voluntarily. He's given a room, a stipend, and a job. No trial, no case. His family's loan is settled that very day. The second path, he stays. Then the agency opens a case for identity fraud and investigates all 41 students. She said that in such cases, usually no one dies. It's just that out of the 41, 38 will have a record of involvement. A record of involvement bars a person from any government service in the kingdom forever. She said she was giving him 24 hours. She left without looking back. Kalen sat on a bench and counted. He counted all night. 48 crowns were sealed away with a single stroke of the pen. His mother came out of the laundry room. The house remained, and 38 people were branded for life because they washed the dishes with the wrong spell. He didn't sleep until morning. By morning, there was nothing left to choose from. Everything had been decided without him. An hour before the deadline, the guard descended into the pit. 8 people in the uniforms of the Academy's internal guard. They were led by Ansel Dorian, and he led them not on his own authority, but with a document signed by his father. The document stated that second-year student Livia Thorne was being detained on suspicion of using a modified spell and was being escorted for questioning. Kalen asked on what grounds she had been chosen her specifically.
Ansel answered readily. He explained that 4 days earlier, student Thorne had used a drying spell in the kitchen wing in the presence of 2 witnesses. The witnesses were Ansel's people. He explained that, according to the regulations, a drying spell removes moisture from fabric. He said that Thorne's student had removed moisture from a living person's hand, causing that person to drop a hot cauldron and suffer a burn. All of this was true. Livia had indeed used a short drying spell. She had used it because a kitchen worker named Had was carrying the kettle alone and was stumbling forward. She pried his fingers apart in 3 counts so he wouldn't spill boiling water onto his chest. He got away with a burn on his hand instead of a burn on his face. Had himself would have confirmed this at any moment. Had couldn't confirm anything. He had been sent with a supply convoy to Milford the night before on orders from the quartermaster's office. Kaylin looked at Ansel and understood everything completely. Ansel wasn't trying to get to him. Ansel understood the main point. Kaylin holds his ground because he has people backing him. So it's not him we need to break. We need to take one of his men and force him to choose. Bran Hald stepped forward, and Kaylin stopped him with his hand across his chest. He stopped him just in time. An attack on the inner guard was no longer a matter of Academy regulations. It was a matter of the crown. Livia didn't resist. She stood up on her own. She managed to say only one thing, and she said it quietly. She said she wouldn't give them anything, and that she knew how to count all the way to the end. They led her down the 41-step staircase. Kaylin didn't follow. He stood there looking at the empty bench, and for the first time in all these weeks, he wasn't counting. He wasn't counting anything at all. Merrill approached and said they had to go see the rector. Kaylin didn't answer. Merrill said they had to go immediately, before the matter reached the capital. Kaylin turned, and the old man fell silent mid-sentence. Later, he said that the boy had the face of a man who had just stopped being afraid, and that it was the most dangerous face he'd seen in 62 years. Kaylin rolled up his left sleeve. There were 6 dark threads, and the pattern between them extended all the way to his elbow. He let his sleeve fall back down. Then he asked Bran to bring from the kitchen whatever was left of the last batch. Bran asked what exactly. Kaylin replied that he needed empty jugs. He needed 4 dozen. He went up to the courtyard and headed neither for the rector nor for the council. Fesk demanded that the request be repeated, and Kaylin repeated it twice. The school barrier, 1 entry, nothing else. The administrator recorded it on a scroll and asked the scribe 3 times if he had made a mistake. The scribe had not made a mistake. In the upper benches, they laughed openly. The school barrier was set up in the first year so that the younger students wouldn't break each other's noses in the courtyard. It raised a wall of dense air in a ring 4 steps wide and held it for 12 counts. Nothing passed through it, neither a stone, nor a record, nor a person. He couldn't strike. He couldn't move. He was the only spell in the textbook that children were allowed to cast without supervision, because it was impossible to cause harm with it, even on purpose. Ansel Dorian declared 4 spells from the 3rd year: Spear, Double Whip, Rift, Arch. The spear pierced a board as thick as a finger from 12 paces away. The rift shattered bones. The arch served as a defense and blocked a direct hit from the spear. Ansel was 29 measures tall, and all 4 entries cost him less than half his supply. He stepped into the circle first and stood in the center as victors do. He had no intention of playing it safe. He intended to finish it all before the courtyard stopped laughing. Kaylin stood right at the line. He didn't go to the center. He stayed on the edge, and only one person in the entire arena noticed. Tyra Weiss sat on the top bench and didn't take her eyes off him. Fesk lowered his staff. Ansel struck with his spear immediately, aiming for the leg. He wanted to break the knee and finish the round in a single strike. The spear flew from his palm, traveled 8 paces, and stopped. It didn't dissipate. It dug into the air and hung there like a needle in felt. A wall stood around Ansel Dorian. It didn't form around Kalen. It formed a 4-step ring around him, and he found himself alone inside it. The courtyard stopped laughing mid-laugh. Ansel struck with his spear a second time and hit his own wall. The wall absorbed the blow and grew denser. He struck a third time, and the wall hummed. Kalen stood at the edge of the circle and did not move. He had made exactly 2 corrections, both of them at night in the pit while 40 eyes watched him. The first correction was in the 4th line. The 4th line specified where the ring would form. For anyone who had ever set up a school barrier, it formed around the person setting it up. Kalen wrote a different location into it, 20 steps from the palm. The spot is chosen with the gaze. The second correction was in the 1st line. The 1st line described where the power came from. With a school barrier, the power came from the student's reserve, which is why it lasted for 12 counts. Kalen erased the reserve and wrote in its place the power expended inside the ring. The barrier stopped consuming him. The barrier began to consume whoever was inside. Ansel didn't know this. He was striking the wall because he didn't know how to do otherwise. Every blow was the price he paid for his own cage. He unleashed a double lash, and the lash circled the ring from the inside and returned to him, and the wall became even denser. He unleashed a rupture. The rupture in the enclosed space struck in all directions at once, and for the first time in his life, Ansel shielded himself with a vault from his own recording. The vault cost him 6 measures. The wall absorbed that, too. The courtyard had been silent for a full minute. Fesk stood with his staff raised and did not lower it because, according to the rules, the circle is not broken until both are back on their feet. Ansel stood. He stood and expended energy. On the 30th count, he understood. He stopped striking and tried to leave. He approached the wall and braced his shoulder against it. The wall had held the stone and had held the spear for 3 years. It held his shoulder all the more so. He walked around the ring once and then a second time, 4 paces across. No door, no crack, no seam. He turned toward Kalen and shouted something through the wall, but the wall wouldn't let even the sound through. The courtyard saw his mouth open but heard nothing. That turned out to be the worst part of it all. Then his father stood up. Master Old Dorian had been sitting on the second bench and hadn't stood up even once the entire time. He stood up on the 40th count. He was a 3rd-level archmage and had held the council's seal at the academy for 20 years. He stepped right up to the line and raised his hand. According to the bylaws, intervening in an open challenge meant defeat for the one on whose behalf the intervention was made. He intervened in front of 40 witnesses and during the Crown's inquiry, and he did so openly. No one stopped him.
He struck the wall with a removal. The removal was a spell that dismantled another spell layer by layer. It cost 8 measures and could remove almost anything cast within the academy. The wall absorbed the removal and grew denser. He struck a second time, doubling the power. The wall grew even denser. He stood there, staring at his own palm, unable to comprehend what was happening. He was striking a first-year inscription with a 3rd-level, school-level removal spell, and all he was doing was making it stronger because it was consuming everything that was put into it. He struck a 3rd time, and on that 3rd strike, the air inside the ring turned white from the pressure, and Ansel Dorian fell to his knees. Old Dorian took a step back. The courtyard watched him. 40 people watched as a 3rd-level archmage struck the school barrier 3 times in a row and failed 3 times in a row. It was this exact count that everyone later referred to, not the 47th time when Ansel fell to his knees. 3.
3 strikes by the Archmage. Kalen wasn't looking at Dorian at all. He was looking at the wall and working. He was doing the same thing he'd done in cell number 4. He touched the 4th line and shifted the dot by half a step. The ring rolled along the stone like a barrel being rolled. Half a step. Another half step. Ansel, on his knees inside, moved along with it because the wall was pushing him in the back and because he had nothing left to stand on. 29 measures had passed into his own cell in 50 counts. The ring reached the edge of the circle. Fesk looked down at it from above, his face turning pale. Kalen marked the point one last time. Ansel Dorian's shoulders crossed the line first. Then his whole body followed. The wall stood for 3 more counts and then faded on its own because there was no longer a single drop of power left inside that it could consume. Ansel remained lying on the stone beyond the circle's boundary. He was unharmed. There wasn't a single scrape on him. Fesk lowered his staff and declared victory for Kalen Vert's student, announcing the transfer of the tournament right in accordance with the Tervain Academy charter. He announced it twice, the second time because the first announcement had been too quiet. Then he stepped down from the judge's platform and did something he had never done in 19 years of service. He personally walked the entire circumference of the circle and examined the stone. He was looking for traces. He was looking for scorch marks from the spear, cracks from the explosion, and melting from the arch. He found only one thing: a ring-shaped strip of dust, a palm's width wide, where the ring had rolled across the floor. He crouched down and touched it. The dust was cold. Fesk had been tallying records for 20 years. He kept scrolls of measurements and knew the value of every line in the textbook. He stood up and looked at the student from the pit and said aloud that the reported record had been applied without any violations and that he saw not a single violation at all. He said that if the council wished to contest it, he was ready to sign the protocol with his own hand. He was a small man, and he knew it. He signed it right then and there. Kalen stepped out of the circle, walked to the stairs, and sat down on the bottom step. He sat upright, keeping his back straight, and from the side, he looked calm. His left arm wasn't moving at all. He couldn't feel it from the elbow down. He'd made 2 major corrections in a single evening and had left both of them in place for the entire duration of the fight. 8 threads lay beneath the sleeve, and the pattern of cracks had risen 3 fingers' width above his elbow. Merrill approached, sat down silently beside him, and asked no questions. He simply unbuttoned the sleeve and looked. Then he buttoned it back up and said one thing. He said he'd seen cracks like that once in his life, and that the man with them had lived for 4 years. Kalen asked what happened next. Merrill replied that afterward, the man had first lost feeling in his arm and then in everything else, and that he wouldn't say anything more about him. It took a long time for the court to disperse. 2 servants carried Ansel away, and he walked on his own, but held on to them as he went. Old Dorian did not approach his son. He stood at the edge, looking at the ring of dust, and remained there until the training ground was empty. He was a man who knew how to count. He did the math. The first-year record had prevented the 3rd stage from being cleared 3 times in a row. That meant it wasn't a first-year record. That meant someone at his academy knew how to change what couldn't be changed. And that meant that a month and a half ago, he'd sent a letter to the capital in which he'd written about this very thing. Tyra Weiss was the last to step down from the bench.
She didn't go to the rector, and she didn't go to Dorian. She walked over to the stairs and sat down 2 steps above Kalen. She was silent for quite a while. Then she said that up until today, the case could have been closed. She explained how. 1 student with 1 1/4 measures, 1 old man who's covering for him, 40 teenagers who saw the pieces but didn't see the whole picture.
All of this would have fit into a no confirmation report, been filed away, and no one would have remembered them again. She said she'd been steering the case toward exactly that for 4 days. She said that now she had 40 witnesses, a signed report from the administrator, and a third-level archmage who had struck the children's barrier 3 times in full view of the entire training ground. Ordvin provided the horses. He gave them without looking or asking why, and that was the only miracle of the day. Kalen told him he was going to fetch a witness. Ordvin replied that he hadn't heard that because he was deaf in his left ear and had been standing on his left side at that very moment. Then he named the senior wagon driver and said that the man accepted bribes in silver, but not in copper. The road to Melnichny Brod ran 18 versts down a rocky trail and another 9 across a field. Kalen couldn't hold the reins with his left hand. Bran rode. Kalen sat behind him, holding onto the saddle with his right hand, and kept track of the time the whole way. The journey took 2 days, and 3 scenes from it remained in the Academy's memory. The first scene took place at the inn by the ford. The head wagoner, named Gunt Laren, listened to their question and replied that he didn't remember anyone named Hada and that he hauled people by the dozen. Bran placed 2 copper coins on the table. Gunt looked at them and turned away. Then Kalen asked the innkeeper for a mug of water from the barrel in the courtyard. The water in the barrel had been sitting there since last week, and a film was floating on the surface. He set the mug on the table and drained it in front of everyone in 4 gulps. A gray lump the size of a pea remained at the bottom. He drank half and pushed the rest toward Gunt. Gunt stared at the mug for a very long time. Then he said that for something like this, at the ford, they pay in silver, not copper, and that he wouldn't accept money for it. He said he had 4 carters in his wagon train, and that all 4 had been drinking from the river downstream from the tanneries for the past 3 years. Kalen had taught him how to put together the basic structure and hadn't shown him a single line of editing. Gunt remembered Hada in a single breath. The second scene took place at the tanner's warehouse. Hada wasn't sent to Melnichny Brod. He was sent further on, and they sent him without a return travel permit, which meant he had no way to get back. For 3 days straight, he'd been hauling wet hides in exchange for food. His right hand was wrapped in a rag over a burn, and the rag had dried stiff. Kalen removed it by drying it in one spot and treated the burn with a cleansing agent, using up the entire remainder of his supply. Hada sat on a barrel and said nothing. Then he said that no one had asked him anything. Not about the cauldron, not about the girl, not even about how he'd ended up in the wagon train in the first place. He'd simply been told to sit down, and he'd sat down. He said he'd spent his whole life sitting down whenever he was told to. Kalen asked if he would go back and tell them what had happened. Hada replied that he would go back and tell them. He said that the boiling water had burned his hand, but not his face, and that he remembered the difference well. The third scene took place on the return trip. They were stopped on a rocky trail 4 versts from the gate. 3 members of the Academy's internal guard were standing there. The senior officer was Captain Dern Mall. He presented a document and said he had orders not to allow anyone not on the lists into the Academy. Had was not on the lists. Had was a hired kitchen worker, and he had been struck from the roster that very evening when he was sent off with the supply convoy. The document was signed by the administrative department. Everything was by the book. Kalen did not argue about the document. He asked the captain one thing. He asked who exactly had ordered that the worker Had be struck from the roster an hour before charges were filed against the student Thorn. Dern Mall replied that he did not know. Kalen said that knowing this was precisely his job. He said that the captain of the internal guard had taken the second-year student into custody based on a document stating that the witness was absent. He said that the witness had not been absent. The witness was taken away. He said that if this came to light,
It would not be the person who signed the roster order who would be held accountable, but the one who was on duty. That's always how it goes. Durnmal was a man with 4 years left until retirement. He had served at the academy for 19 years and had taken cadets into custody 31 times, and not once had he thought about it for more than a single evening. He stood on the path for quite a while. Then he approached Had, examined his arm himself, and asked who had removed the bandage. Had replied that it was this boy who had removed it, and that he had done so without causing any pain. The captain looked at Kalen's motionless left hand and at his face and realized that the boy had been holding himself up for the past hour. He ordered his men to let all 3 pass and instructed them to record in the logbook that there had been no detention. Then he said he would ride with them all the way to the gates. He said that if the paperwork got moving, he wanted to be standing where he could see it first. The case against Livia Thorne fell apart in an hour and a half. Tyra Weiss took Had's testimony personally and recorded it in the presence of the council secretary and Captain Mall. Had told everything exactly as it happened. He had been dragging the cauldron alone because the other worker had been assigned to unloading. He fell forward. A second-year student pried his fingers apart before the cauldron reached his chest. He sustained a burn on his hand from the splashes. There were 2 witnesses, and both were standing behind Ansel Dorian's desk. Both testified that they had seen the record being used, but had not seen the kettle. Tyra Weiss asked them if they had seen the kettle. Both replied that they had not. She asked if they had been facing the kitchen passageway. Both replied that they had been. She said that there were 7 steps in the kitchen passageway from the door to the stove, and that it was impossible not to see a person with a kettle within those 7 steps. That was the end of it. She did not press charges for perjury. She said she didn't have time for that. Livia Thorne was released that same evening. She walked out of the lower guardhouse on her own, walking steadily, and there was a bruise on her left cheekbone. She didn't say a word about it then, nor did she mention it later. She asked only one thing. She asked how many days were left until the review. Kalen replied that there were 14. She nodded and went down into the pit. That very night, she sat down at a table and worked until morning. Merrill said that people like that are the last to be broken, and people usually come to regret it. Retribution came the next morning, and it came from 2 sides at once. First, the council convened for an emergency session and reviewed Kalen Vert's application for a water purification system. It could no longer be rejected because the grounds for refusal had disappeared along with the loss of tournament eligibility. The council did not reject it. The council approved it. And immediately afterward, it issued a second decision. The project approved by the council becomes the property of the Tervain Academy, along with all derivatives and applications. The author is to receive a one-time payment of 2 crowns. Kalen read this 3 times. 2 crowns. The loan had been 48. Old Dorian didn't interfere with the approval. He played it smarter. He turned the victory into a piece of paper that stripped Kalen of everything he would earn from then on. Merrill said that from now on, any new entry submitted by him would end up in the same place. Kalen said he wouldn't submit anything else. The second message came from Tyra Weiss. She summoned him to her place that evening and, for the first time ever, locked the door. She said she'd done her part and was now waiting for him. She said she needed to see it once with her own eyes, and that she didn't need any paperwork. Kalen asked why she needed this if the case was going to higher-ups anyway. She replied that that was exactly why. She said that whoever came next wouldn't look at anything. He'd just take it. Kalen showed her one thing. He took a marker, the simplest entry from the 2nd month of the 1st year, a glowing symbol that lasts half a day and does nothing else. He made one change to it right in front of her and explained aloud what he was doing. He touched the 5th line, the duration, and entered a condition there instead of a time. The mark stopped lasting half a day.
It now lasted as long as there was a person in the room. He placed it on the table and left. The sign went out behind him and lit up again when he returned. Tyra Weiss watched this in silence. Then she asked him to show her his hand. He did. She examined the cracks for a long time without touching them. Then she sat down and said something that made the room go very quiet. She said that in her 9 years of service, she had handled 4 cases involving identity fraud. She said that all 4 people had been found. 2 turned themselves in. 1 was apprehended at the border, 1 was turned in by his brother. Kaylin asked where they were now. She replied that all 4 were dead and that they had not died as a result of execution. She said that the investigative authorities had not executed a single one of them. All 4 had died before their cases reached court, and all 4 had died of different causes in different places, and each time the cause had been plausible. She said she had filed a report on this twice, and both times the report had been returned with a note stating it was inappropriate. She said she didn't know who was getting rid of them. She only knew that this someone found out about the case before it even reached the desk. She said that Magistrate Dorian's letter had been sent to the capital 41 days ago, and that the story about the cage with the root dog had reached the capital on its own 6 days later, and that now, after the training ground, everyone along the road to the capital knows about him. She said they would come for him, and they would come soon, and that it wouldn't be an investigation. Kaylin asked what she herself wanted from him. She answered honestly. She said she wanted to get at least one such case to the desk while it was still alive, and that in 9 years, this was her only real interest. She said she'd take him to the capital under her own protection and on her own authority, and that it was a bad option, but she didn't see any others. She gave him a day to decide. Kaylin returned to the pit and didn't even make it to the bench. The floor beneath his feet trembled, not much, just once, as if something heavy deep beneath the rock had shifted and settled differently. Lime fell from the ceiling. Tick Morven asked what it was. No one answered. A minute later, the bell of the maintenance section rang upstairs, not 3 times, as they do for a fire, but endlessly. It had never rung like that before. The bell rang for a quarter of an hour. The collapse occurred in the northern underground passage, where the maintenance crew had been dismantling an old drainage channel for the past 3 weeks. The passage caved in at a depth of 20 paces, revealing behind it a stone masonry structure that wasn't shown on the Academy's blueprints. The masonry was older than the Academy itself. Behind it lay a sealed tunnel. The first to enter it was the foreman of the repair crew, a man named Olg Hamir, along with 2 workers carrying lanterns. None of them ever came back up. Half an hour later, something emerged from the tunnel that would later be referred to simply as the Ash. It was not a beast. It had neither bones, nor eyes, nor a fixed form. It moved across the ground like a low gray wall as tall as a man, and wherever it passed, stone remained stone, but all living things ceased to be alive. It moved more slowly than a walking man. It made no sound. Rector Olvin Castor descended to the lower gates 10 minutes after the first signal. He had not gone below the 2nd tier for 7 years. He was a 4th-level archmage, and there was no one higher than him at the Academy. He cast a barrier in the northern passageway and stopped the gray wave right at the stairs, holding it back for 8 minutes. During those 8 minutes, the younger students were evacuated from the north wing. In the 9th minute, cracks began to appear in the barrier. The rector struck the wave with a full-power 4th-level blast. The blast entered it and vanished. The wave rose half a step higher. Olvin Castor struck again, using 1/3 of his reserve, and the wall rose once more. Then he understood and ordered everyone to retreat to the upper tiers. He spoke aloud in front of everyone present that this thing consumes power and that striking it means feeding it. He said he didn't know how to stop it and that this was the first time in 40 years he had spoken those words. Ordvin brought the guards, stationed them on the second flight of stairs, and led the artisans upstairs. Magister Old Dorian brought up from the second tier all those who had reached the third level. There were 4 of them. All 4 took turns striking it from the landing, and everything they released was absorbed by the wall, causing it to grow. By evening, it had taken over the entire northern passageway and begun climbing the 41-step staircase. There was a pit beneath that staircase. Kalen led his people out through the kitchen passage 40 minutes before the wall reached the lower door. 41 people. They didn't lose a single one. He was the last to climb up into the courtyard, where Tyra Weiss found him and said one thing. She said that in 2 hours, people would begin leaving the academy, that they would be leaving through the south gate, and that not everyone would make it out through the south gate. Kalen didn't listen any further. He went to look for Merrild.
Merrild Grizz was sitting in Fesk's archive, sifting through the Academy's oldest inventories. He'd been doing this for an hour and a half. He looked up and said he'd found it. In the 400-year-old founding inventory, there was an entry for tunnel number 2, sealed off before the first building was constructed. Opposite it was a single-line note, left as is due to the impossibility of removal. Merrild said that 400 years ago, there was no barrier here. There was a seal, and the seal was maintained every year using funds from the Academy's general reserve. He said that the expense for it appeared as a separate line item in the financial ledgers under the heading Maintenance of Lower Contours. He said that this line item had been struck from the budget 11 years ago as obsolete. Kalen asked who had crossed it out. Merrild replied that there were 3 signatures there, and that the names were irrelevant now. He said that something else was important. The seal hadn't been removed. They had simply stopped supplying it. It had survived for 11 years on its remaining reserves, and this year they had completely depleted it. Kalen asked to see the record of the seal itself. Merrild replied that there was no record. There was only a 2-line description. It imposes a restraint on the contents of the tunnel and is updated annually. And that's when Kalen understood. He understood everything at once, and he understood so clearly that his ears rang. The ash wasn't a creature. The ash was a restraint that had been left without a master. It was a record that, for 400 years, had held something inside, a record that had consumed itself and turned itself inside out. It was an overlaid thing. It lay on top of the world like paint on wood. And he had the record that removes what lies on top of the material. He'd made it 40 days ago from a school purification ritual, tested it on his palm, and worn a bandage for 3 days. He climbed to the landing of the second staircase. Standing there were the rector of the 4th tier, Ordvin, with his guard, and Tyra Weiss. The gray wall was 12 steps below and was rising 1 step per minute. Kalen said he could remove it. Olvin Castor looked down at him. He was a 4th-level archmage and had just wasted half his reserve to no avail. He asked how much reserve the student had. Kalen replied that he had 1 measure and a quarter. Old Dorian said the boy needed to be removed from the platform. The rector did not remove him. He looked at Kalen for a very long time, and then said that he had been drinking his water for 4 days, that he had seen the ring-shaped dust trail on the training ground, and that in 22 years he had never been in a worse situation. He ordered everyone to step back and make room. Kalen stepped forward, alone. He was almost empty and therefore could see the lines. He saw them by the gray embankment. There were 3 lines there instead of 5, and all 3 were torn. He didn't touch them. They were not to be touched. He raised his right hand and began to rewrite his own correction, rewriting it on the spot. He made 3 corrections in a row and completed them in 9 counts. The first was in the 3rd line.
He took the measurement and stretched a dot the size of a fingernail across a strip 20 steps long. The second on the fourth line, he moved the point of action from his palm down the staircase. The third was on the first line. He erased his own reserve and wrote into the source the power that already lay beneath. The ashes were power. He was sated by the fourth step and 2/3. Kalen made him pay for his own withdrawal. The edits didn't go in like a splinter. They went in like a knife into the forearm. He didn't scream only because his jaw had locked up. His left arm turned black from wrist to shoulder, and cracks spread up to his neck. He held his ground. The purge descended the stairs in a 20-step streak, making not a sound. The gray wave neither exploded nor dissipated. It simply ceased to exist. It was like paint peeling off stained wood. The top layer had come away, revealing the bare stone of the northern passageway beneath, and lying on that stone were 3 workers from the repair crew. 2 were dead. Foreman Olg Heimir was still breathing. The streak stretched 34 counts long, traversed the entire passageway all the way to the masonry, and entered tunnel number 2, where it died out because there was nothing left to feed it. Silence fell. Olvin Castor was the first to descend the stairs, and he went down alone. He walked the entire length of the passageway, running his hand along the walls. Then he returned and stopped in front of the student, who was being supported by Bran Hald and Livia Thorne because he could no longer stand on his own. Academy Rector Tervain looked at him for quite a while. Then he spoke aloud, making sure everyone on the platform could hear him. He said that for 40 years he had believed that strength was measured by how much you could put into it. He said that today he had seen a boy, not even 1.5 meters tall, lift something that the 4th level couldn't handle. He said he had been wrong for 40 years, and that he was saying this once in front of witnesses and would not repeat it. The document was a promissory note from the Castlevane trading house made out to the merchant Iward Sorn, and it was dated the spring before last. Livia unfolded it and waited for Kalen to read it. He could read, but he couldn't hold it, so she held it herself. The amount was 212 crowns. Below that was a note transferring the debt and the clerk's signature. Livia said that the Sorn trading house hadn't gone bankrupt. The Sorn trading house had been trading in salt and flax for 26 years and had closed the year before last with a profit. She said something else had happened. 3 of their convoys in a row had been held up at the Mill Ford checkpoint due to a discrepancy in the seals. Each wagon train was held up for 9 days. Salt doesn't hold its value for 9 days in a wet year. By the 3rd wagon train, the firm was unable to meet its short-term obligations and took out a loan from Castlevane at a rate of 1/5 per month. 2 months later, the loan was called in full and demanded immediately. Her father signed over the warehouse, then the house, then the shops. She said that 7 months after that, the Castlevane firm was trading salt on those same 3 roads. Kalen asked where her father was. She replied that she didn't know. She said she'd last seen him on the day they came for the ledgers, and that her mother had died that same winter. Then she said the most important thing. She said that before it all began, her father had gone to the Tervain Academy 3 times and had submitted 3 petitions to have the road seals verified. She said that the council secretary had accepted the petitions and that all 3 had been left unanswered. And she said that the clerk who signed the debt transfer used the same signature as the one on Kalen's mother's loan. She had seen that loan. Kalen had shown it to Merold in the pit 2 months ago, and she had been standing right behind him at the time. Kalen lay there, sorting through the papers. He sorted slowly because, after the ashes were removed, everything came together slowly.
The travel seals were affixed by the Academy's administrative department under a contract with the Crown along the entire stretch from the cliff to Mill Ford. It was the administrative department that sent Had with the wagon train. It was the administrative department that, 11 years ago, cut funding for the maintenance of the lower contours. And it was the steward of the Castlevane household who hired a private courier 2 hours after the ashes were removed. He said aloud that these weren't coincidences, but deliberate actions. Livia replied that she'd known this for 2 years, and that was why she had ended up at the academy. She said she hadn't gone there to study. She said that 4 measures of reserve would be of no use to her anywhere, and that she'd understood that from day one. She'd come for the papers. She'd spent 1.5 years stuck in the 3rd tier because no one is transferred out of the 3rd tier. No one pays attention to the 3rd tier, and because access to the lower scroll vault is granted only to those sent there on duty. She said that during that time she had transcribed 49 incoming records and that she had been waiting for one person. She had been waiting for someone who would be able to do something about it. Kaylin asked why she hadn't said anything sooner. She replied that there was nothing to say. She said she had a piece of paper and nothing but that paper, but now she had him. In the morning, a summons arrived. It did not come from the inquiry office. It was delivered by a royal escort of 6 men and handed to the rector in the presence of the entire council. Tervain Kaylin Vert, a student at the academy, was to travel to the capital to present the case regarding the lower circuits as the person who had lifted the restriction. The departure was scheduled for the 3rd day. The escort was ordered by the Crown. Tyra Weiss read the document twice and said that it was genuine and that this was precisely the problem. She explained. The case regarding the forgery of her department's forms was making its way up the chain and was already poised to be swept under the rug, just as the 4 previous ones had been. And now a second case regarding the lower contours had emerged, and it had been opened not by the investigative authorities, but by the royal chamber. The second case was high profile and public, and in it, Kaylin was appearing not as a suspect, but as a witness. She said that as long as the second case was ongoing, the first one could not be touched. She said that this was the only reason he was still alive after that report. And she said that as soon as he testified regarding the lower contours, his defense would end immediately. Merrill asked what she was proposing. She replied that she was proposing they go. She said that she had one person in the chamber in the capital, and that documents submitted to the chamber didn't disappear the way preliminary investigation reports did. She said that in 9 years she hadn't been able to save 4 people, and that she was taking the 5th one herself. There were 11 days left until the winter review. The loan was due on the day of the review. Kaylin told the rector that he could not leave before the review because expulsion for failure to appear would result in his mother's house being foreclosed. Olwyn Castor listened to him and did the first thing he had ever done openly for him. He summoned the secretary and dictated an order stating that the student Kaylin Wirt is exempt from the winter review due to fulfilling a royal summons, and that his place would be reserved for him until his return. Then he paused to think and dictated a second line. The academy would assume responsibility for servicing student Wirt's loan for the duration of his absence, using funds from the administrative budget. He said this was not a gift. He said that the academy had acquired the water purification system from him for 2 crowns, and that, following the lower circuits incident, he considered the balance to be somewhat different. Old Dorian lodged a protest. The rector replied with a single sentence. He said that the investigation to determine who was responsible for the cessation of maintenance on the lower circuits was proceeding as planned, and that Master Dorian would do well to focus on that. Dorian raised no further objections. On the night before their departure, Kaylin gathered everyone in the upper hall because the pit had been filled in. 41 people. He did not speak for long. He said that the workshop was operating without him and following the old rules.
He said that no one was providing a complete record and that he would not forgive any violation of this rule. He said that Merrill Grizz would remain in charge. Merrill replied that he would not remain in charge because he was going with him. Kalen objected. The old man said that the objection was not accepted. He said he was 62 years old and that for 11 years he had run a class where no one had ever made it past the third year. He said that during that time he had written the word unfit over 200 times in the journal, and that he had written it about living people. He said that now he would go and see how it all ended, and that this was not up for discussion. Bran Hald said he was going too, and said it in such a way that arguing was pointless. Livia said nothing. She had simply been standing by the wagon with her bag since morning. The oldest one left in the pit was 14-year-old Tick Morven, and it was a decision that everyone, including himself, later laughed at. Kalen managed to shout only one word. He shouted, "Slope." Tyra Weiss reacted faster than anyone else and turned her horse across the wagon, and in that very instant, 9 restraints came loose at once. They weren't holding people. They were holding the forest. The dry pine grove on the slope had stood dead for 8 years, not of its own accord, but because someone had cut it down 8 years ago, left it standing, and bound it with ropes. 400 paces down the slope came crashing down in a single wave. The first impact struck the main crossroads. 3 horses and 2 men were swept under the trunks at once. The road ceased to exist for 60 paces. The wagon was struck on its side and overturned toward the river, and Bran Hald managed to pull Livia out from under it by the collar and drag her to the water. The driver was killed by the shafts. Kalen was thrown from the wagon and fell onto his right shoulder. He did not lose consciousness only because he had fallen into the wet sand. He got up on his knees and saw that the slope continued downward. And then people emerged from the clearing. There were 11 of them. They weren't in uniform. They didn't shout a word, didn't demand anything, and didn't try to take anyone alive. They marched in even formation and walked in silence, and that was the most terrifying thing of the entire day. Tyra Weiss managed to set up a barricade and took out 2 of them in the very first count, and her men stood beside her. There were 2 of them, and both were killed within a minute. She had been a Crown investigator for 9 years and knew how to fight, but she was taken down on the 6th count by a blow to the side. She fell behind a rock and never got back up. Kalen saw this from where he stood and could do nothing. He had 1 measure and a quarter, a blackened hand, and 3 days without sleep. He was empty. And that's why he saw the line. He saw them, on all 11 of them. Each one bore the same thing, a concealment mark. A simple third-year technique that hides one's tracks and scent and makes one's footsteps silent. It was on all 11 of them, and it looked the same because a single person had placed it there. Kalen did not touch the concealment mark. He touched what was inside it. The concealment had 5 lines, and the first of them indicated where the power came from. For all 11, the first line led to the carrier's own reserve. Kalen couldn't access all 11 entries at once. He accessed 1. He chose the one closest to him and wrote in its first line, not the carrier's reserve, but the reserve of everyone within 20 paces of it. 1 edit, a heavy one. It shot through his spine, and he fell face down in the sand, unable to lift his head. But it went through. 11 people were marching in tight formation, 6 steps apart. All of them were within 20. 1 concealment began to draw power from 10 reserves at once and draw it without limit, because the limit was in the 3rd line, and Kalen hadn't touched the 3rd line and had no intention of doing so. The concealment swelled. It enveloped all 11 of them, along with their trail, their scent, and their sound, and enveloped itself. The people could no longer hear one another. They could no longer see one another because the concealment hides even from its own when it becomes larger than necessary. The formation came to a halt. For 8 seconds, they stood on the road, blind and deaf. And in those 8 seconds, Bran Hald emerged from the water clutching the shaft of an overturned wagon. Bran Hald weighed twice as much as any of them, and his channels were bursting at the third count. He couldn't hold on to a single record. He shut the shaft. He held it perfectly. He took down 4 of them before they even realized where the threat was coming from. The 5th one hit him in the thigh, and Bran sat down in the sand, continuing to take down anyone who came closer with the shaft. Livia struck with a short, dry blow to a single spot, hitting his wrists and forcing him to drop his weapon 3 times, and once that saved Bran's life. The 6 who remained eventually found Kaelin. He was lying right by the water and couldn't get up, so they walked straight toward him, moving slowly because he was unable to do anything else. Merald Grizz stood in their path. He was 62 years old. His reserve was 9 measures, and he hadn't released a combat record in 20 years. He set up a basic barrier, a first-year barrier, forming a 4-step ring around himself and the boy lying on the ground. 12 counts. He didn't know how to make adjustments and never learned. He simply set up what he knew and held it while standing. The barrier withstood the first strike, the second as well. On the third, the wall turned white, and Merald poured the remainder of his power into it and held it for another 4 counts. In total, he held it for 19 counts instead of 12, more than his reserves allowed and more than the record permitted, and afterward, people spoke of it as something that simply doesn't happen. 19 counts were enough. During those 19 counts, 2 survivors from the royal escort, who had been knocked down by the gun barrels but not killed, approached. They picked up the remaining men from the road, shot them in the back, and it was all over in a minute. The barrier went out on its own. Merald Grizz stood for 1 more count and then sat down on the sand very carefully, the way tired people do. He wasn't wounded. He didn't have a single scratch. He had given everything he had, and once reserves are exhausted, the body draws on the next and the next, but that's no longer strength. Kaelin crawled over to him. He was still alive, conscious, and his gaze was clear. He said the barrier had held. He said it the way one speaks of a job well done. Then he said that the Third Order Journal was in the upper hall on the 2nd shelf, and that the last entry there was from the 13th. And he said he asked that it be finished. Kaelin said he would finish it. Merald Grizz died 2 minutes later, silently, and without a single word about himself. Of the 11 attackers, 3 remained alive. 2 died before evening. The 3rd lived longer. Tyra Weiss was alive. The blow had grazed her ribs, and she'd lost a lot of blood, but she was conscious, and the first thing she did when she came to was crawl over to the last survivor and get to work. She'd been doing this for 9 years and knew how to do it quickly. She didn't ask who had sent them. She asked where they'd come from, where they'd been staying, who'd paid for their lodging, and how their cover had been arranged. She gathered the details. The man remained silent for the first half hour. Then he began to speak, talking about the road, the inn in Vetlianka, and how the ambush on the hillside hadn't been set up by them, but by others, and that it had been arranged in advance. He said the order had come through an intermediary. Tyra asked for the intermediary's name. He said he didn't know the name. She asked whose mark was on the paper. And that was when he uttered the first syllable. He said Kas, and said nothing more, because blood began to flow from his throat, and a minute later he died. Tyra Weiss wrote down this syllable in charcoal on the back of the travel document in the presence of 2 witnesses from the royal retinue, and had both of them sign their names. She said that a single syllable was not proof, and that the proof would be that it was written down on the spot and certified. She said that now she had the document. They kept count until evening. Of the 6 men from the royal escort, only 2 remained alive. The coachman is dead. Neither of Tyra's 2 men survived. Merrill Grizz is dead. Bran Hald is wounded in the thigh and has lost a lot of blood, but he will survive and be left with a limp. Livia is unharmed. Kalen is unharmed, but cannot move his left arm at all, and his right arm works intermittently because the final blow struck his back. Everyone except Merrill was buried on the spot. Merrill was placed in the wagon. Kalen said that the old man would travel to the capital, return to the academy, and rest there, and that there was no point in arguing with him about it. No one argued. That evening, Kalen sat by the river and didn't count. He didn't count days, measures, or crowns. Livia came over, sat down beside him, and remained silent for a long time. Then she said that the markers on the slope had been set up 8 years ago. She said she'd been on the slope and examined the markers while he was lying there. She said the markings were on a felled pine grove, that the cut was old and even, and that this was the work of a logging crew, not a bandit. She said that no one had touched them in 8 years, and that someone had kept that slope ready for 8 years, waiting for the right moment. Kalen asked how many such places there were on the road to the capital. She replied that she didn't know. She said that if they set one up, they'd set up the rest as well. He sat by the water and watched as it grew dark, and finally understood a simple thing he hadn't grasped for 2 months. He'd thought he was fighting Ansel Dorian, then the council, then the investigation. In reality, all that time he'd been struggling inside someone else's construct. It took another 6 days to reach the capital, and they traveled differently this time.
Tyra Weiss wouldn't let the wagon stop at a single inn. They spent the nights in the fields without a fire, and the 2 survivors from the ambush took turns standing watch. On the 4th day, she began to dictate. She couldn't write herself because the right side of her body was paralyzed. Livia wrote for her. They drafted 3 documents over the course of 6 days, rewriting each one 4 times. The first was about the lower circuits. It listed the name of the person who had lifted the lien, the names of 32 witnesses, and an excerpt from a 600-year-old inventory of the pledge, with a note stating that the boundaries had ceased to generate revenue 11 years ago. The 3 signatories to that deletion were named individually. The second document concerned road seals. It contained 49 excerpts by Livia from the incoming register of the lower repository, arranged in a column by date. 3 petitions from the merchant Iward Sorn, requesting verification of the seals. The dates they were received. No action taken on any of the 3. 9-day delays for 3 convoys from the House of Sorn. The dates the debt was transferred to the Castlewine House. And interspersed among them were 18 other names, because the House of Sorn was neither the first nor the last. Livia had found this a year ago and couldn't do anything about it on her own. The third document was the shortest and the most dangerous. It was about the slope. 9 markings on a pine grove that had been cut down 8 years ago. Location, date of inspection. A tally of Kas, certified by the crosses of 2 witnesses, written in charcoal on the back of the travel document. Tyra said that the third document was worthless on its own, and that its power lay in the fact that it came third. She explained how it worked. 1 case can be closed. 2 cases can be split between different agencies, where they'll die off separately. 3 cases that converge at a single point can neither be closed nor split, because different people will read them, and at least one of them is bound to want to curry favor. The capital came into view on the 7th day from the hill. Kalen had only seen big cities in other people's stories. It was gray and low-lying, nestled in a bend of the river, with smoke rising from 8,000 chimneys above it. The royal palace occupied 3 buildings along the eastern wall, and they were not allowed into the first one. The clerk on duty said that the witness summoned in the case of the lower circuits must appear on the appointed day, and that the appointed day was 11 days hence. He said that until the appointed day, the witness would be housed in the detention center under the chamber's care. Tyra Weiss listened to this and said one word. She said no. She explained it to Kaylin on the street. A detention center isn't a prison. It's better than a prison. They feed you there, they give you a room, and in 11 days, anything can happen to a person. And all 4 of her former partners died in places just like that. She said that 2 of the 4 had died of pneumonia. She said that the chamber conducts its affairs honestly. You just have to make it to the ward alive. Then Kaylin asked her if there was anyone in the capital whom she didn't have to pay and to whom she didn't have to explain anything. She thought for a moment and replied that there was one, but that she didn't want to go to him. The man's name was Olg Hymir. He was the foreman of the repair crew whom Kaylin had rescued from the northern passageway. He had been taken to the capital for treatment at the Crown's expense because he was the sole survivor in the containing case. He had been lying in the infirmary attached to the chamber for 3 weeks. Tyra said that a laborer wasn't a witness and that his word was worth the least of all. Kaylin replied that it was worth exactly as much as necessary. Hymir recognized him immediately. He tried to stand up, but couldn't, so he simply took Kaylin's right hand, held it, and remained silent. Then he said he had been dead for 7 minutes and that he remembered every moment of them. He asked how he could repay him. Kaylin said he didn't need someone from the infirmary, but someone from the street. He needed someone who knew where the Castlewine offices were located in the capital, who worked there, and who delivered documents for them. Hymir laughed, and the laughter caused his nose to bleed. He said he'd been working for repair cooperatives for 31 years, that the cooperatives fixed everything for everyone, and that he knew every basement along the eastern wall in the capital, including the Castlewine basements, because Hymir's cooperative had laid the floors there 2 years ago. It took 3 days of what Tyra Weiss called legwork. Levia and one of the surviving traveling agents, because Kaylin couldn't stand for long and Tyra couldn't walk at all. They didn't gather secrets. They gathered trivia. The Castlewine Trading House maintained 4 offices in the capital, with the main one located on Skvornaznaya Street. It dealt in salt, flax, and loans secured by urban real estate. It had not a single noble name on its paperwork, nor a single shareholder listed with the chamber. The owner listed on all documents was Remet Castlevine, 71 years old, who lived in a country house and had not been seen at the office for 6 years. All business was managed by the manager. The manager's name was Viren Hold. He was 44 years old. He was neither a mage nor a nobleman. He had started as a clerk in the administrative department of the Tervain Academy, served there for 9 years, and left 14 years ago. This is what Livia discovered. She found it in the incoming records book of the lower storeroom because clerks write a letter of resignation when they leave, and that letter remains on file. Viren Hold left the academy 3 years before maintenance of the lower circuits was cut from the budget. And a year after his departure, the House of Castlewine received its first contract for road maintenance on the section from the cliff to Mill Ford. Kaylin pored over these papers all evening and understood the entire scheme. The House of Castlewine wasn't taking anything over. It positioned itself in the middle, between the caravan and the road, between the family and its duty, between the academy and its ledger. It didn't take away. It became the indispensable link and waited as long as necessary. 8 years for a cut-down slope isn't long if you know how to wait. He said aloud that you don't fight against records like that. Tyra replied that that was exactly why she had lost 4 times. On the 4th day, they were found. Not the killers. A man in a fine suit arrived openly in broad daylight, introduced himself as the manager of the Castlevine estate, and asked for a quarter of an hour. They granted it. He sat down and laid out 2 papers on the table. The first was a loan to Iris Vert, a laundress from the candlemaker's quarter, for 48 crowns secured by the house. The second was a notice of full repayment, bearing the seal and dated the day before yesterday.
The clerk said that the firm had paid off the loan at its own expense, that the candlemaker's house was now free of the lien, and that Mrs. Vert had been notified.
He said that the Castlevane firm had been in business for a long time and knew how to distinguish a profitable investment from an unprofitable one. Then he laid down a third document. It was an employment contract. The firm was offering Kalen Wirt, an apprentice, the position of senior bookkeeper with a salary of 400 crowns a year, full support for his mother, and coverage for medical expenses at any level. He said he had seen the hand at work and knew what would happen next, and that there were 3 people in the capital who knew how to stop such a thing. He said the firm would pay all 3 of them. Kalen asked what was required in return. The steward answered honestly and without haggling. He said that in return, tomorrow must not come to pass. No 3 documents in the chamber. 1 certificate regarding the lower circuits, just as requested. He said that the house wouldn't interfere with the matter of the circuits, that those responsible for falsifying the expenses would be punished, and that the house would even help find them. He said that the discussion concerned only the other 2 documents. Kalen stared at the payment notice for a very long time. 48 crowns, 14 years of running the laundry, his father's house. It was all lying before him, settled and paid for, and it was final because the document already bore the seal and could not be revoked. That was the most powerful move. They had given him what he'd been fighting for 2 months. They gave it to him before the conversation, so that he would speak with a full stomach. He asked the steward one thing. He asked how much a simple 3-cartload house in Sorn had cost. The steward replied calmly that he didn't keep old records. Kalen said that in that case, he would answer himself. He said that the simple house had cost 212 crowns, plus his mother and father. He said that his own house was now worth 48, that he liked the price, and that he'd take it. And he said that all 3 documents would be sent to the chamber. The steward gathered his papers. He didn't get angry or make any threats. He only said that the house didn't make offers twice and that he was sorry. He left. Tyra Weiss said that now they didn't have 11 days. Now they had the night. She was half right. No one came at night. They came in the morning, and they came legally. The chamber secretary appeared with a bailiff and announced that a counterclaim had been filed in the case regarding the lower contours. The petitioner was listed as Master Old Dorian. The petition stated that Academy student Terwayne Kalen Wirt had used an altered form of the record in the Northern Passage in the presence of 32 witnesses, that this fell under the code regarding the substitution of forms, and that the chamber should refer the case to the Crown for preliminary inquiry before hearing the witness. Tyra read it and laughed, and her headband came loose from the laughter. She said that Dorian was trying to save his own skin by signing off on the deletion, and that he didn't even understand who he was working for. She said that the complaint was valid and could not be contested, and that Kalen would now not be heard by the chamber at all. He would appear not as a witness, but as the accused, and would go to the preliminary inquiry that very hour. Livia asked if there was a way out. Tyra replied that there was one, and it was a lousy one. Testimony in the chamber could be given by someone other than the person summoned. It could be given by anyone listed as a party to the case. She said there were 3 people named in the case regarding the circuits: Kalen Vert, Merold Grizz, who is dead, and Olg Heimir, the foreman of the repair crew, who is in the infirmary and can't sit for more than a quarter of an hour. Kalen said that a quarter of an hour would be enough. He said that Heimir wouldn't have to read the papers aloud because the ward clerk would do the reading. Heimir would only need to bring them in and identify himself. Tyra said that this was legal, that it would work, and that after that, Heimir wouldn't live much longer. Kalen replied that he would ask him himself. He went to the infirmary and asked. Olg Heimir listened to everything until the end, including the last part. Then he said that he had been dead for 7 minutes and that, after that, he considered everything else a gift. He said he would carry the papers. In the morning, they helped him up,
dressed him, and put him in a hired carriage, and Kalin walked it to the corner of Skornyazhnaya Street. He couldn't go any further because 2 men from the chamber were already following him. The carriage drove off toward the eastern wall. Kalin remained standing on the corner, and for the first time in 2 months, he didn't have to count anything. There was nothing to count. Everything was already on its way without him. The session lasted 40 minutes.
Old Hamir entered the hall on his own, walked to the railing on his own, and held onto it the entire time while the clerk read. He gave his name and location and said that he had been dead for 7 minutes in the northern passageway of the Tervain Academy and that a second-year student had carried him out of there. He said nothing else. 3 documents were read in succession, aloud, and according to the chamber's rules, everything submitted within a single hour must be read aloud. The reading could only be interrupted by a decision of 3 out of 5 counselors. 2 demanded an interruption after the second document. 3 did not support the motion. Later, it was said that one of those 3 simply hated the other, and that this was what decided the matter. Tyra Weiss remarked that half the cases in the kingdom are decided this way. The third document was read to the end. The casus was read aloud in the chamber in the presence of 5 counselors and 20 clerks, and was recorded in the minutes along with the signatures of 2 witnesses. After that, it could no longer be dismissed. The chamber ruled on 3 matters: to identify and prosecute those responsible for the cessation of expenditures. Regarding the road seals for the section from the cliff to Melnichny Broad, a separate investigation was to be opened, and the entire 9-year record of incoming documents at the Tervain Academy was to be requested. An on-site inspection was to be scheduled on the slope near Vetlyanka. Olda Hamir was taken back to the infirmary, and he died 11 days later. He died from an old wound, and he died peacefully, and anyone who wished could consider it a natural death. Kalena was arrested that same day. She was arrested lawfully based on a complaint filed by Old Dorian and taken in for questioning before the Crown. She was not taken to the local police station, but to the old wing by the south wall, where those accused of impersonation are held. Tyra Weiss could do nothing to prevent this because the complaint was valid on all counts. She told him one thing as a farewell. She said that he was now in the safest place in the capital. She explained, as long as 3 investigations were proceeding simultaneously, the man at the center of them was worth more alive than dead. She said this would last exactly until the investigations were concluded. They held him for 19 days. A windowless room, 2 steps by 4. They fed him, they didn't beat him. Every day, an interrogator named Stephen Roos would come in, ask the same questions, write down the answers, and leave. On the 6th day, Kalin stopped answering altogether. On the 9th, Roos said he didn't understand why Kalin was stalling and that the case was simple. Kalin asked him how many cases involving identity fraud he had handled. Roos replied that there were 4. Kalin asked how many people in those cases had lived to see their trial. Roos fell silent and didn't show up the next day. During those 19 days, more happened on the outside than in the entire 2 months prior. First, the chamber requested the Tervain Academy's 9-year log of incoming correspondence. Rector Olvin Castor handed it over in its entirety that very day, without redacting a single page, and attached the administrative log to it. Later, people said he could have dragged it out for half a year and no one would have blamed him. He didn't. He said one sentence to the chamber's secretary, and it made it into the minutes. He said that for 22 years he had been signing papers without reading them, and that others had already paid the price for it. Second, according to the incoming log, there were not 18 names, but 31. Over 9 years, 31 trading houses were held up at the road checkpoints for periods ranging from 4 to 14 days, and 26 of them subsequently went into debt. All 26 loans went through the Castlewine firm. Third, Olda Dorian was summoned for the lower circuits first among the 3. He held out for 4 days.
On the fifth day, he submitted a petition for leniency in which he named the other two and revealed information that had not been requested of him. He revealed that the decision to write off the expenses for the lower circuits had not been made by the council, and that the document detailing the obsolescence of the circuits had been submitted to the council by the clerk of the finance department. The clerk's name was Viren Hold. Dorian explained that he had signed it without looking and had received 200 crowns that same year from the Castlewine estate for the construction of a country house, and that at the time he had not made the connection between the two. Later, he said that he truly had not made the connection. They believed him. That turned out to be the worst part of all. The man had sold a seal that had been in the family's possession for 400 years, for 200 crowns, and hadn't even realized what he was selling. Fourth, Viren Hold was arrested on the 9th day, not in the capital, but on the road to the northern border. He was traveling alone and carrying a box of papers. He hadn't had time to burn it. Inside the box were calculations for 31 houses, notes on downtime, and 11 years' worth of correspondence with 6 clerks from various departments. There was also an inventory of 9 tax assessments on the slope near Vetlyanka, dated 8 years ago and marked for annual review. He was a very meticulous man. He wrote everything down. Fifth, Remet Castlevine, age 71, died at his country house on the 12th day. No one came to see him. He died alone. The court later determined that he had been the owner of the Castlevine house only on paper, and that this document had been drawn up by Hold 18 years earlier, when the old man had gone bankrupt and sold his name. Kalen learned all this only later. In the room, 2 steps by 4, he knew nothing. He lay there counting the cracks. They reached his right shoulder and ran across his chest. His right hand worked for 3 hours a day. The rest of the time, it wouldn't obey him. He slept 10 hours at a time and woke up exhausted. He thought he would die here, that it would be quiet, and that no one would prove anything. He was wrong. On the 20th day, the door opened and Tyra Weiss walked in. She entered on her own, walking with a cane. Her right side had never fully recovered. She placed a piece of paper on the cot and said that the Royal Inquisition was dismissing the case regarding the alteration of form due to lack of evidence. Kalen read it and couldn't believe it. He asked how that was possible when 32 people had witnessed the removal of the restraint on school security camera footage. She sat down and explained at length. She said that the code regarding falsification of records punishes the alteration of entries made in the kingdom's registry. She said that all 4 of her predecessors fell under this provision because they had altered the combat and medical records listed in the registry. And she said that school-level records had never been entered into the Crown's registry. Not the fire, not the drying, not the marking, not the cleansing, nor the school barrier. They were considered too insignificant to register. For 400 years, no one had entered them into the registry because it never occurred to anyone that anyone would alter them. She said she brought this up on the 19th day, and that she had been searching for 9 years but found it in 19 days because for the first time she knew exactly what to look for. She said there was no record. Kalen sat there staring at the paper, realizing that his wretchedness had saved him. That very same wretchedness that Merrill Grizz had taught him to hide behind. He asked how long this would last. Tyra answered honestly. She said that the chamber had already submitted a petition to have his school records entered into the registry and that it would be approved by spring. She said that starting in the spring, everything he did would become a crime. She said he had the winter. He left the old wing on the 21st day. It was December. 2 people were waiting for him outside, Livia Thorne and Bran Hald, who was leaning on a cane and limping, which made him seem twice as broad. Bran said they'd been waiting every day since the 6th. Livia said nothing. She walked over and stood beside him, and that was all. Then she relayed the news, keeping it brief. 14-year-old Tick Morvin had run the workshop for 41 days without losing a single person or a single record. The academy was still operating. Rector Castor had submitted his resignation, but it had been rejected. Old Dorian had been stripped of the council seal and is awaiting trial. Ansel Dorian took his papers and went home. He will not return to the academy. She also said that, over the past 19 days, 11 people had left the academy's administrative department of their own accord. Kaylin asked about Hold. Tyra replied that Viren Hold has been testifying for 4 days now, and he's doing so willingly, in detail, and with specific dates. She said he isn't defending himself, he's explaining. She said that over the course of 11 years, he had built something he himself admired, and that now, for the first time, he had been granted a hearing. She said she had seen this happen twice before, and that it was the worst thing that could happen. Kaylin asked what would happen to him next. Tyra said that, based on the totality of the evidence, he faces life imprisonment. She said this and added that in 11 years he had never once killed anyone with his own hands, that he hadn't installed the retaining walls on the slope, and that the order for the road hadn't come from him. She said that there wasn't a single document in his file regarding Vetlyanka besides the inventory, and that he had listed it as property. Kaylin asked who then had commissioned the road. Tyra Weiss was silent for a long time. Then she said that on the third day, Hold had pointed out one thing that hadn't been recorded in the minutes. He had shown that the road seals for the section from the cliff to the ford near the Castawine house were not held by him personally. The contract for the road seals came from the Crown through an intermediary, and the intermediary had changed 3 times over the course of 11 years. Each time, it was a government agency rather than a trading house. She said she had no further testimony to offer, and that what came next was something she would not be allowed to discuss. And she said one last thing. She said she had submitted a request for a transfer. She said it was not for the preliminary investigation. She had requested a transfer to the department handling road seals, and they accepted her, and that this was the only time in 9 years that her request hadn't been rejected. Kaylin asked why she was doing this. She replied that she had brought one case to the desk while still alive, and that now she wanted to see where the desk led. He returned to the academy 6 days later. He entered the upper hall, took a third-order journal from the second shelf, and opened it to the entry dated the 13th. After that, the journal was blank. He wrote with his right hand and wrote slowly because his hand could hold a pen only for the first 3 hours after waking. He wrote that over the course of 11 years, his mentor, Merrild Grizz, had entered the word unfit more than 200 times, written the word unfit in this journal. He wrote that all those more than 200 times it was a mistake and that the mentor had asked him to record it here. Then he thought for a moment and added another line. He wrote that the entry was made by a student for whom that same word had been the first to be recorded in this journal. He had only 1 winter, and he spent it working. It took 74 days and went down in the Academy's history as 3 paintings. The first was of a hand. The royal physician, sent by the chamber, examined him during the first week of January and spoke briefly. He said that the cracks were not a disease, but wear and tear, and that wear and tear could not be treated. He said that every correction added to the strain, and that the strain did not disappear but was merely redistributed. He said that at this rate, the body would last about 3 years. Kaylin asked what would happen if he stopped completely. The physician replied that in that case, 5 or 6 years, but that the cracks were already set and would not go away. Kaylin thanked him and returned to his desk, and that very evening made 2 corrections in a row. Livia saw this and said nothing at the time. She spoke 3 days later and kept it brief. She asked how much time he had left, if she were to be honest. He replied, 3 years. She asked why then he was wasting them on kitchen records. And then he explained to her what he'd been working toward all winter. He said he'd realized one thing while still on the road near Vetlianka. He said he'd fought with people and won every time, yet it never changed anything because the structure stood behind them. He said that the structure couldn't be defeated by a record. The structure could only be rendered unnecessary. He said that the Castlevane house had stood for 11 years between the caravan and the press, and between the family and its duty, and had survived because there was no way around it. He said that he himself had been thrown into a pit because he had 1 measure and a quarter, and that the entire academy was founded on the principle that power is a reserve. He said that if the reserve ceased to be decisive, then the structure would cease to hold. Livia asked how this could be done in 3 years. He replied that it couldn't be done in 3 years and that he had no intention of doing it himself. The second scene was about how he distributed resources. He gathered the workshop and announced a new rule, one that was the exact opposite of the old one. Previously, no one received a full record. Now, everyone received a full record. He abolished the rationing system in a single evening. Merrill was dead, so there was no one left to argue with, and Livia didn't argue. She only asked about the investigation. Kaylin replied that the investigation was over, that another one would begin in the spring, and that there was no point in hiding anymore because you can hide 1 person, but not 40. He began teaching not the records, he began teaching the lines. He explained aloud that every entry had 5 parts. The first indicated the source of the power, the second, how much of it was being used, the third, the magnitude of the result, the fourth, where it would occur, and the fifth, when it would end. He couldn't show them the lines, only he could see them, but he could name them and could say what to change it to, and what would happen as a result. Out of 40 people, 9 were able to understand. Of the 9, 3 were able to carry it out, and they did so slowly and poorly and only with the 4th line, which was the easiest. Tick Morvan shifted the marker spawn point by 12 steps over 11 days of work, and afterward couldn't hold a spoon for a full day. Kaylin watched this and understood the main point. He wasn't an exception by blood, he was an exception by chance. He saw the lines because he'd spent the night in a cold storage room with an empty supply. For the 41 people in the pit, the supply was almost always empty. That was exactly why they ended up in the pit. He said this out loud to Livia, and she was silent for a long time, then said it was the cruelest joke she'd ever heard. The third scene was about spring. The Chamber's petition to have school records entered into the registry was granted in early March. Kaylin learned of this 4 days earlier in a letter from Tyra Weiss. The letter stated that, as of March 16th, the spark, drying, marking, cleansing, and school barrier would be entered into the kingdom's registry, and that any assertion to their form from that day forward would be subject to the code. Tyra wrote that she had done everything she could and that she had only managed to buy him 5 days. Kaylin gathered the workshop on March 13th. He laid it all out plainly. He said that starting on the 16th, everything they had been doing would become a crime, that there would be an investigation, and that none of them were obligated to continue. He said that the notation he had taught them would remain with them and that they wouldn't be able to prove anything because proof could only be established through a complete notation. And now everyone, and no one, knew the complete notation. He said he was leaving the academy himself so as not to drag them down with him. Tick Morvan asked where he would go. Kaylin replied that he would go where school records aren't listed in the registry. Livia said there were no such places. He replied that there was one. And then he explained to them the latest idea he'd come up with over the winter, his real plan. He said that the kingdom's registry lists entries by name. He said that, according to the code, altering the form of an entry in the registry is punishable. He said that there's no punishment at all for creating a new entry because no one had for 400 years, and it had never occurred to anyone to ban it. He said that all winter long he had been collecting not corrections, he had been rebuilding it from scratch. He showed them what he had been working on for 74 days. It was neither a modified purification nor a modified barrier. It was an entry he had built from scratch using 5 lines, and it bore no resemblance to any in the textbook. It did a simple thing. It drew power not from a person's reserves, but from the temperature difference in the room, held it for a day, and released it back on demand. It was weak. It yielded 1.5 measures per day. 1.5 measures was exactly the total reserve of Kalen Wirt. He said he had named it the Accumulator and that he was submitting it to the chamber as a new development on March 14th, that is, 2 days before the registry went into effect. He said that, by decision of the council, the Academy owned all his developments and their derivatives, and that therefore the Accumulator would go entirely to the Tervain Academy, and that this was exactly what he wanted. He said the Academy wouldn't be able to hide it. Olvin Castor approved the submission the very next day. He approved it personally and did not forward it to the council at all. He read the description twice and then said one thing. He said that if it works, in 20 years, the question of how much reserve capacity a person has will no longer be the first question asked during admission. He said that by then, the entire 400-year-old structure of this academy would have to be rewritten. And he said that he was 68, that he wouldn't live to see it, and that he would sign it anyway. He signed it. The storage device was submitted to the chamber on March 14th and was accepted for registration with that date. On March 16th, the registry took effect. The investigators arrived on the 18th. They didn't come for Kalen, they came for the workshop. They were led by Stephen Roos, the very same man who had visited him for 19 days in his tiny room 2 steps by 4. He took the workshop ledger and the logbook and questioned 19 people over 2 days. He found nothing. No one had a complete record because everyone knew the full details, and they knew them as one knows a craft, not as one guards a secret. Roos shut down production on the 3rd day and, before leaving, said one thing to Kalen in private. He said that, out of 4 cases, this was the first time he was leaving empty-handed, and that he had no regrets. Then he asked if it was true that the storage device was working. Kalen replied that it was working and that it produced 1.5 measures per day. Roos said that his son had 4 measures, that the boy was 11 years old, and that he already knew the boy wouldn't be going anywhere. He got in his carriage and left. Kalen left the academy on March 22nd. The rector kept his spot open for him, and the spot remained his for 8 years. All that time, he remained on the rolls. They saw him off in the courtyard, and there were more than 41 people there. The courtyard was full. He did not give a speech. He told Tiku Morvan that he was now in charge of the Third Order Journal, and that he had better not dare write the word unfit in it. Bran Hald rode with him and asked no one for permission. Livia Thorne left a day earlier and traveled to the capital, because the chamber had summoned her as a witness in the proceedings regarding road seals, and because those proceedings had been ongoing for 4 months already and required someone who had personally prepared 49 extracts. She said goodbye, adding that she would find him herself, but did not say when. A letter from Tyra Weiss caught up with him at Millford. The letter contained 4 lines. The proceedings regarding road seals have led to an intermediary. The intermediary has been identified. It is the Royal Roads Department. Come. Dot. The Royal Roads Department occupied 2 floors in the 3rd building of the chamber and handled everything in the kingdom related to tolls, seals, bridges, and inspections. Its head held the rank of 3rd class and was named Answald Cray. He was 56 years old. He had held the position for 12 years, and prior to that had served for 9 years in the same chamber, and before that he had been a field engineer building crossings. Tyra Weiss explained all this to Kalen on the very first evening, laying it out as precisely as a report. Then she got to the point. She said that in 11 years, not a single document had linked Cray to the House of Castawine by even a single line. She said that the connection was through people. 6 clerks from Hold's correspondence had served in the Roads Department, and 4 still serve there today. She said that this was insufficient for a charge, that it looked like a coincidence, and that the chamber had recorded it as such. Kaylin asked what the department had been doing on the stretch from the cliff to the ford. Tyra replied that the department had been affixing seals and scheduling inspections and set the duration of the layover. She said that it was the department that decided who would stay for 4 days and who for 14. She said that Hold did not pay for the seals. He paid for the length of the layover. She said that this could not be proven on paper because the duration of the layover is not recorded anywhere as a decision. It is recorded as a circumstance. Kaylin asked what, then, the slope at Vetlyanka proved. Tyra replied that the slope was the only place where the structure had moved from the paperwork into the real world. She said that the chamber had conducted an on-site inspection in February and that the inspection confirmed 9 retaining walls dating back 8 years and some tree cutting. She said that they had hit a dead end after that. The retaining walls were still standing. It is unknown who erected them. Hold's inventory proves that he knew about them and listed them as property, but it does not prove that he commissioned them. Kaylin asked whether the retaining walls had been photographed during the inspection. Tyra replied that they had not, and that they had chosen not to photograph them so as not to disturb the inspection site. He asked if they were still there. She replied that they were, and then he told her the reason he had come. He said that the record had 5 lines and that the first one indicated where the power came from. He said that a restraint that had been in place for 8 years could not be powered by the person who had placed it, because a person does not give off power for 8 years straight. He said that such things are always anchored to a source, and he said that the source was an address. Tyra Weiss didn't understand right away, so he explained it more simply. He said that if you look at the first line of the 9 restraints, you'll see where they draw their power from. And that if they're not drawing power from the earth or the sun, but from someone else's contour, then that contour belongs to someone and is recorded in someone's books. He said that for 400 years, no one had looked at the first line because no one knew how to see it. Tyra sat there for a very long time. Then she said that this would require the chamber to conduct an on-site inspection, and that they wouldn't grant such a request at her request. Kaylin replied that she wouldn't be the one to file the request. The request was filed by Livia Thorne. She was a witness summoned for the proceedings and had the right to file a motion for an inspection involving the person who had captured the lower contours. The motion was reviewed for 6 days and granted on the 7th. And it was granted because the proceedings had been stalling for 4 months and the counselors were looking for something to latch onto. They set out at the end of April. The chamber assigned 2 people. Tyra traveled 3rd, now as an official of the proceedings. Livia traveled 4th. Bran went 5th and didn't ask anyone anything. Kaylin spent half a day on the slope near Vetlyanka. He couldn't see the lines as long as he had a reserve, and his reserve was now building up on its own because he had the accumulator he'd assembled that winter standing next to him. He removed the accumulator and handed it to Bran, then sat on the slope for 4 hours doing nothing. By evening, he saw it. All 9 detention centers were powered by a single circuit, and this circuit ran underground along the road, extending all the way from Melnichny Ford. Kaylin walked along it for 11 versts over 2 days, and Bran supported him by the arm for the last 3 versts because, after 2 days without a reserve, he was collapsing. The circuit ended at the pier of the bridge across the Tesnaya. The bridge across the Tesnaya had been built 9 years ago by the Royal Roads Department. The bridge's piers were supported by a stabilizing circuit. Such circuits are installed on all government-owned bridges, funded by the Treasury, and recorded in the Register of Structures with annual inspections. 9 retaining walls on the cut slope had been funded for 8 years by the public budget allocated for the bridge over the Tesnaya. Tyra Weiss sat right down on the embankment when he said that. She said she now understood why no one had found them for 8 years. She said that the expenses for them were listed in the structure log as expenses for the bridge, and that the bridge was listed on the road department's balance sheet, and that the inspection report was signed by a department engineer every year. She said that the inspection report is a signature, and that a signature is a name. The structure log was requested 11 days later. The inspection report for the bridge over the Tesnaya River had been signed 9 times over 9 years, and all 9 times by the same person, second-class engineer Gved Olman. He was arrested in May. He didn't last even a day. He revealed that the bridge's expenses had been inflated from the very first year, that he had recorded the excess at the instruction of his immediate superior, that he had been doing this for 9 years, and that he received 40 crowns a year for it. He stated that he knew nothing about any deductions and that he thought his superior was the one stealing. They believed him. Gved Olman's immediate superior for all 9 years was Oswald Kray. Things moved quickly from there, just as they always do when the paperwork finally lines up. Kray was suspended at the end of May. During a search of his home, no money was found. Instead, they found 11 years' worth of correspondence, including 42 letters from Byron Hold. All 42 were businesslike and polite, and not a single one contained a word about any crime. Tyra Weiss said that this would have been enough for dismissal, but not enough for a trial. Something else was enough for a trial. Hold testified against him on the 8th day after Kray's arrest. He gave detailed testimony with dates and did so willingly, as he did everything. He testified that he wasn't the first to approach Kray. He testified that 14 years ago, when he was a clerk in the logistics department at Tervain Academy, a man from the Department of Roads came to him and proposed a simple arrangement. The department assigns transport routes. The clerk knows which convoys are traveling and what they're carrying. A third party provides the loan. He showed that he hadn't devised the scheme himself and that he had merely set it up and expanded it to 31 houses. And he explained that the idea to remove the expense for the lower circuits from the academy's budget was his own, and that he is still proud of it because it was the most honest work of his life. The trial took place in June and lasted 9 days. Kalin was present for 1 day. He testified about the first of the 9 deductions, speaking for a quarter of an hour in simple terms, and the attorneys listened without interrupting. Then he was asked how he had seen it. He replied that he could see the recording device when he had no reserve. He was asked if another person could learn to do this. He replied that over the winter, 3 out of 41 had learned it, and that all 3 were students in the 3rd level hall of the Tervain Academy, where those with little reserve are sent. The room fell very quiet. Later, Tyra said that this very phrase was the most dangerous one of the entire 9 months, and that he had uttered it in the one place where it could not be buried. The sentences were handed down at the end of June. Oswald Kray was stripped of his rank and sentenced to 20 years. Byron Hold received a life sentence. Gved Olman received 7 years. Old Dorian received 4 years and was barred from holding office. The Castlewine trading house was liquidated, and its assets were used to cover reparations. This process continued for another 6 years, and not everyone received their share. The Thorne family received a warehouse and 2 shops, but lost both their father and mother. Livia Thorne accepted the documents, signed them, and on the very same day leased out both shops and left. She said she had no intention of trading in flax. On June 29th, Kalin walked out of the chamber building, sat down on the steps, and was unable to stand up. He was 19 years old. Cracks ran across his chest and neck, extending to his right shoulder, and his right arm functioned for only 2 hours a day. Bran carried him in his arms to the rented house, walking 8 blocks and refusing to let anyone hire a carriage. The doctor came in the evening, examined him, and said the problem wasn't the crutches. He said he hadn't used crutches for 4 months and that the cracks were healing on their own. He said the weight was already bearing down and that his body was now simply sinking under it. Kalen asked how long. The doctor replied, a year or a year and a half. He said he could have put it differently, but that he saw a man who was counting. That night, Tyra Weiss came and sat by the bed and said that production had shut down and that she was leaving the ward. She said she was 41 years old, that she'd been searching for one thing for 9 years and had found it, and that there was nothing left for her to do there. Kalen asked what she was going to do. She replied that she didn't know yet. Then she told the truth. She said that it wasn't Hold who had come up with the plan, and that the man from the Department of Transportation who had come to see him 14 years ago had never been named. She said that Cray had denied it in court, that he denied it calmly, and that she believed him. She said there was one more step somewhere, but that she wouldn't reach it. Kalen said she didn't need to. She asked why. He replied that they'd dismantled the structure without a court order. He said the court had taken 4 people. He said that the Castlevane house had stood for 11 years in a place you simply couldn't avoid passing through, and that now you didn't have to pass through it. He said that at the Tervane Academy there was a storage unit that provided 1.5 measures per day to anyone who had nothing, and that the Academy was obligated to distribute it as its own development, and that it was already doing so. Tyra said that was a drop in the bucket. He replied that a drop was all there was. In the morning, Livia arrived and brought a letter from the Academy. Tick Morvan wrote that over the spring, 49 people had submitted transfer requests to the Third Order Hall, and that for the first time in 400 years, they were asking to be admitted there of their own accord. He wrote that the storage unit had been installed in 3 bedrooms in the north wing, and that the juniors now arrived for their first measurement not with 4 measures, but with 5.5. He wrote that the administrator, Fesk, had recounted the measurements twice and had cursed both times. And he wrote at the end that he kept the third order log and that he had never once written the word unfit. He lived not a year, nor a year and a half. He lived 4 years and 7 months, and everyone who knew him considered this his final revision, even though he made no further revisions. The royal physician visited him 3 times over the years, and on the 3rd visit said he had made a mistake in his calculations and did not understand why. Kalen replied that he understood. He said that his weight had stopped increasing when he stopped being the only one who wore it. For the first 6 months, he lived in a rented house in the capital and didn't work at all. Then Livia Thorne sold both shops and used the money to buy a house 2 versts from the Tervane Academy, near the lower road, and moved him there herself without asking his consent. The house was large and old and had stood empty for 4 years. She said she wouldn't trade in flax, but she would run a school. That's how it all began. They didn't officially open the school or make any announcements. People simply began coming to it. The first to arrive were those who hadn't been accepted into the academy based on their measurements. There were many of them in the kingdom. There had always been many, and before this, they simply had nowhere else to go. They hadn't been taught record-keeping because record-keeping is taught from a textbook, and the textbook costs 14 crowns. Without tournament rights, it isn't issued. Kalen didn't teach from a textbook. He taught that every spell has 5 lines. He explained this using the same words he'd used in the pit. The first line tells where the power comes from. The second, how much of it is used. The third, the magnitude of the result. The fourth, where it will be. The fifth, when it will end. He couldn't show the lines to anyone. Only he and 3 out of 41 could see them, and then 19 more people over the course of 4 years, and all 22 were people with an empty reserve. But he could explain. He could say that the first line is an address and that not only people have addresses. He could say that the 4th line is the cheapest and that you have to start with it. He could say that the fifth shouldn't be touched until you've lived with the entry for half a year. Over the course of 4 years, about 200 people passed through the house by the lower road. Of those, 70-something left empty-handed. The rest learned something. 22 learned to see. The kingdom's registry grew throughout those years, and it grew quickly. By the 3rd year, over 200 entries had been added to it, including all school records. Altering the form of any of them was punishable under the code. Over the course of these 4 years, the Crown Investigation Office opened 9 cases regarding the alteration of entries and closed all 9 without bringing charges. The reason was always the same. The code punished the alteration of an entry already recorded in the register. It did not prohibit the creation of new entries. And new entries were coming in from the house by the lower road to the chamber. Over the course of 4 years, 41 were submitted. They were not submitted by Kalin. They were submitted by students, each under their own name, and each was entered into the registry with the date and the author. 26 of the 41 were compiled from school notes by people who had less than 3 measures of reserve. Kalin did not submit a single one. His only submission remained the storage device from March 14th. The Trevane Academy owned it in its entirety by decision of its own council, and by that same decision was obligated to transfer it as its own development to anyone who requested it, and to charge a set fee of 2 crowns for it.
Alwyn Castor did the only thing he could. He did not change the decision. He simply did not contest a single request. Over the course of 4 years, the Academy distributed the storage device to 420 educational institutions and city administrations, as well as 3 hospitals. The rector resigned in the 5th year, and his resignation was accepted. In his farewell speech, he said that for 26 years he had believed that power was a reserve, and that he was leaving later than he should have and earlier than he wanted to. Ansel Dorian returned to the Academy 2 years later, and not as a student. He served in the administrative department and performed his duties well. By general consensus, he was better than anyone who had been there before him. He visited the house on the lower road once, arriving in the winter, and sat there for half a day, talking with Livia rather than with Kalin. He asked about the seals. At the Academy, he oversaw the review of contracts, handling it strictly. In 3 years, he terminated 11. His father left after 4 years and lived in a country house for which he had once borrowed 200 crowns, and his son did not visit him. Tyra Weiss did not return to either the inquiry or the chamber. She settled 2 days' journey away and set about what she called old cases. She reopened cases that had been closed 20 years before her time and found in them what she had once sought in her own 4. She found 2 more structures of the same kind in other parts of the kingdom, and both were smaller and both had fallen into ruin from a single piece of paperwork. She visited Kalin twice a year and always brought paperwork with her, and always said she was giving it up and always returned to it. She never spoke again of the man from the Department of Roads, whose name was never revealed. Bran Hald lived in the same house and limped more severely with each passing year. He tended the yard and the farm and, in 4 years, had not learned a single new notation besides the flash. He said that was enough for him. Tick Morven ran a 3rd-tier hall at the Academy until he was 18, and then left for the north to open a second house just like it. He wrote letters once a month. They were poorly written but very detailed. Livia Thorne managed the household accounts, correspondence, and reception. She never married and never left. No one said anything about what had happened between her and Kalin during those years, and they themselves didn't speak of it either. In his 4th year, he stopped walking. By the 5th year, only 1 finger on his right hand still worked, and he could speak and listen and nothing else. He continued teaching until his final month, teaching while lying down, with students brought to him in groups of 3. Cracks had already appeared everywhere, including on his face, yet he refused to have the mirrors covered.
saying that they were not wounds but accounts, and that the accounts must be seen. He died in September of the 5th year. He died in the morning, and that day 4 students were sitting in his room, one of whom was an 11-year-old boy with 3 measures of reserve, whom the former investigator Stephen Rice had brought to the house. That morning, Kalen was explaining the 4th line to him. He was explaining it for the 3rd time because the boy didn't understand. He told him that the 4th line indicates where the result will be, and that everyone spends their whole lives setting it before themselves because that's what's written in the textbook, and that it's written in the textbook simply because someone wrote it first 400 years ago. He said that the textbook isn't the law of the world. The textbook is someone else's habit. Then he fell silent, and the boy waited quite a long time for him to continue, but there was no continuation. They buried him in the courtyard of the house by the lower road. Livia wouldn't allow him to be buried at the academy, even though the rector's office had asked twice. They did not inscribe any rank or title on the stone because he had neither. They inscribed a single line, and they did so at her behest. They wrote that here lies a man who possessed 1 measure and a quarter. 11 years later, the crown abolished the height measurement requirement as a condition for admission to the kingdom's academy. It was not abolished out of mercy. It was abolished because by that time there were more than 900 entries in the registry, and over 300 of them belonged to people who measured less than 5 measures. Maintaining a rule that excluded 1/3 of the registry's entries in the registry had become absurd. The decree had been prepared in the chamber for 3 years, and its basis consisted of 49 excerpts once compiled by a second-year student in the lower scroll repository of the Tervain Academy, along with the proceedings regarding road seals and the Book of Structures containing 9 inspections of the bridge across the Tesnaya. Livia Thorne lived to see this decree, read it, and said nothing. The Tervain Academy's Third Order Journal is still preserved today. Its last page is entirely covered in writing, and more than one person contributed to it. The first entry on it, made in December in crooked right-handed handwriting, states that instructor Merold Grizz had made over 200 mistakes and asked for this to be recorded here. Below that are other lines, and there are many different handwritings. The Third Order Hall itself ceased to exist 6 years after Kalen's death, not because it was closed, but because it was no longer being filled. There was no one left to send there.